Close your eyes and stand on a shore that no longer exists. It is a summer night, more than 3,000 years ago, and the sea is warm around your ankles. Behind you, an island glows, oil lamps burning in 100 windows, painted courtyards still holding the heat of the day, a place so peaceful it has never needed a single wall to defend it. Somewhere a woman laughs. A boy carries water past a fresco of blue dolphins. And out on the dark water, far to the north, a mountain that has slept for 1,000 years draws one slow breath. You cannot see it yet. You do not know that this quiet, golden world, this first great empire of Europe, is living its last untroubled evening. The waves keep coming in, gentle and endless. Listen. This is how it began, and how it was erased. Let us go back further still, before the lamps, before the frescoes, before there was anyone at all to give this place a name. Let the centuries fall away like water off a hull, and settle instead on the island itself, lying alone in the middle of a warm sea, waiting. For an island is older than any story told upon it, and this one has a shape you should come to know before we meet the people who loved it. Picture, then, a long spine of stone laid across the water from east to west, narrow, mountainous, unhurried, the fifth largest island in the whole of that inland sea the ancients would later call the middle of the earth. Crete. Some 260 kilometers from end to end, yet in places so slender you might cross it on foot between sunrise and dusk, from one blue coast to the other. It sits where nothing else does, south of the Greek mainland, north of Africa, west of the shores of Asia. A stepping stone dropped by the gods into the exact center of 3 continents, so that whoever held it could reach out in any direction, and whoever wished to sail between those worlds must first pass within sight of its mountains. And what mountains! Feel them rise beneath you as you drift westward down the island's length. In the far west, the great white massif the shepherds would one day call the Lefka Ori, the White Mountains, their bare limestone peaks pale as bone, snow lying in their high hollows well into the warmth of early summer, so that from a boat far out at sea they seem to float, disembodied, above the haze. Then the land dips and swells again into the enormous shoulder of Ida, the tallest of them all, more than 2,500 meters of rock crowned in cloud, with a deep cave hidden in its flank, a cave where, the later Greeks would swear, the infant Zeus himself was raised in secret. And eastward again, the Dictys range, folding down at last toward the sea. 3 great ranges, then, like the vertebrae of some sleeping animal, running the whole length of the island and dividing it into 100 separate valleys, each one its own small world, cut off from its neighbors by walls of stone. Now let your eye come down from the heights and rest in the gentler country between them, for here is where the life will gather. On the southern side, sheltered beneath the bulk of Mount Ida, spreads the broad and fertile plain of the Masara, the largest lowland on the island, a long ribbon of good dark earth where olives will grow heavy on their branches and barley ripen gold under a generous sun, where vines will drink the heat and give it back as wine. This is the island's larder, its quiet wealth. Grain and oil and wine, the 3 great treasures of the ancient world, all of them rising here, in the warm silence between the mountains and the sea. A land that could feed a people, and then feed a good deal more besides. But do not imagine an island that gives itself up easily to the water. Walk its edges and you will find that much of the coast is hard and unwelcoming, cliffs falling sheer into the swell, long stretches where no ship could safely land, harborless shores where the sea merely dashes itself white against the rock and withdraws. And yet, threaded between these forbidding stretches, secret and unadvertised, lie the coves. Small crescents of shingle tucked behind a headland, deep water inlets screened from the open sea, hidden anchorages that a stranger sailing past would never notice at all, but that a people who knew their own coast could slip in and out of like a key into a familiar lock. An island, in other words, that was easy to defend and hard to surprise. Difficult to raid, simple to leave, and blessed with just enough sheltered water to launch 1,000 ships upon the world while keeping the world itself politely at arm's length. You begin, perhaps, to feel the shape of the thing. A fortress of stone with a garden at its heart, set squarely astride every sea road worth the sailing. Feel, too, its moods as the year turns. The long dry gold of summer, when the hills go tawny and the cicadas soar the afternoons into a shimmering drone and the sea lies flat and hospitable for months on end. The soft wet green of winter, when rain sweeps in from the west and the streams run full and the high peaks whiten. The wild anemones and the wild orchids scattering color across the spring meadows. The scent that rises from the whole island in the heat, thyme and wild sage and pine resin and salt, the smell of a place baking gently in the sun. It is, and always was, a beautiful place to be alive. A place, you might think, where a people could grow up unafraid. And a people did. Long before the Greeks we read of in the old poems, long before Athens or Sparta had so much as a name, there rose upon this island a civilization of extraordinary grace, the first true civilization anywhere in Europe. They raised great palaces of many hundreds of rooms without a single defensive wall to guard them. They painted their world in colors so fresh that when we uncover their walls today they still seem wet, leaping dolphins, blue monkeys, ladies in flounced dresses, bulls in mid-charge, lilies swaying in a painted wind. They carved gems no bigger than a fingernail with a precision that would not be matched for 3,000 years. They sailed and traded and grew rich and, so far as the silent evidence lets us tell, they did all this in peace. But here is the strange and haunting thing, the thread you must carry with you now into the long night ahead. For all their brilliance, for all their beauty, these people left us not one line of history we can read. They wrote, their clay tablets survive by the hundred, pressed with a script of tiny, careful signs. But that earliest script has never been deciphered. No one alive can read it. They have left us their art and withheld their words. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the names of their kings, or their gods, or their island in their own tongue. The very name by which we know them, a Minoan, is not their own at all, but one borrowed, thousands of years later, from a Greek legend of a king who may never have lived. So we are left to do the only thing we can. We must listen to the stones. We must read a lost people in the paint they left drying on their walls, in the seeds burned in their storerooms, in the shape of the coves where their ships once lay. And somewhere out beyond the northern horizon, past the edge of everything they knew, that sleeping mountain waits, patient, and not yet named either. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, the island had to be found. Someone, long ago, had to come across the water and step ashore for the very first time. Come with me, then, back across a stretch of time so vast it hardly seems possible. Set aside the palaces you may have imagined, the painted halls and the great stone courts, for none of that exists yet. There are no bulls leaping across frescoed walls, no ships heavy with oil and copper, no kings, no scribes, no gods with names. There is only an island lying green and quiet in a warm sea, and a low hill rising gently above a valley, its slopes furred with wild olive and scrub, with lentisk and terebinth, with the pale silver of time. The hill has no name. The people who will one day call it something have not yet arrived. And the year, as near as we can reckon it, is close to 7,000 years before the birth of Christ, 9,000 years, give or take, from where you lie now, warm and drowsy and far away. Picture the sea first, because the sea is how they came. Somewhere out on that bright water, low in the swell, a boat moves toward the shore. It is a small thing, this boat, perhaps little more than hollowed timber and hide, driven by paddle and patience, and in it ride a handful of people who have already come a very long way. They did not spring from this island. Crete, in this age, holds no one. It is empty of human voices, empty of smoke, an untouched place of birdsong and wind. These travelers have crossed open water from somewhere to the east, from the coasts of Anatolia most likely, carrying with them a cargo more precious than gold, though it would fit in a few small sacks, seed grain, and the memory of how to make it grow. They bring emmer wheat and barley. They bring the ancestors of sheep and goats, of cattle and pigs, for none of these creatures belong to Crete either. Everything that will one day make the island rich, they carry ashore in their own hands. Imagine the moment the keel grinds against the shingle. Imagine bare feet stepping down into shallow, sun-warmed water, and the strangeness of solid ground after days of open sea. They look up, and they see the hill. We cannot know what drew them to that particular rise of land above that particular valley, but we can guess, because they chose well, and people who choose well usually choose for reasons. There is fresh water here, a stream threading the valley floor. There is shelter from the worst of the wind. There is good earth, deep and workable, and gentle slopes that catch the sun. And so, on that low hill that a far distant people will one day call Kephala, the first fires are lit. The very first curl of wood smoke rises into a Cretan sky that has never known it before. Now let the days lengthen and soften into years. Watch them clear the land. It is slow work, patient work, pulling scrub, grubbing out roots, burning back the tangle of thorn until a patch of bare brown soil lies open to the plough, though there is no plough yet, only the digging stick and the hoe and the labour of backs bent low. Into that cleared earth they press the emmer wheat, and the barley, and wait. And the island, which has never been asked for anything, answers. Green shoots rise. The first harvest is cut with blades of flint set in wood, and the grain is ground between two stones into a coarse pale flour, and there is bread. On the hillside, the sheep and goats crop the wild herbs and grow fat, and their milk and their wool become part of the rhythm of the days. Children are born who have never seen the eastern shore their grandparents came from. To them, the hill is simply home, the only world there is. And here is the quiet marvel of it, the thing that makes this place unlike almost anywhere else. These people do not move on. Season after season, they stay. They build their houses of mud, brick and stone, small square rooms clustered close, and they live in them, and cook in them, and sleep in them. And when a house grows old, when its walls slump and its floor sinks with the weight of years, they do not carry the rubble away. They simply level it, pack it down, and build again on top, a new house upon the bones of the old. And their children do the same. And their children's children. Layer upon layer, floor upon buried floor, generation folding gently into generation like the pages of a book pressed slowly shut. You must understand how slowly this happens, for slowness is the whole of the story here. There are no events to speak of, nothing a chronicle would trouble to record. No battles, no kings, no sudden turns. Only the ordinary miracle of ordinary life, repeated so many thousands of times that it begins, imperceptibly, to raise the very ground. Each rebuilt house adds perhaps a hand's breadth to the mound. But a hand's breadth across a lifetime, and a lifetime laid upon a lifetime, and lifetimes stacked in their hundreds, and the hill itself begins to grow. It swells upward, not from any river's silt or any shifting of the earth, but from the patient accumulation of human living. The mound at Knossos, when at last it is measured by people who come very long after, will stand some 7 meters deep in places, 7 meters of packed and buried homes, of hearth ash and broken pots and the soft dark earth of daily existence. Every centimeter of it is time. Every centimeter is someone's whole life, lived out and pressed down and built over. Think of how many they were, across those thousands of years. Think of all the mornings that began on that hill, all the fires kindled at dawn, all the grain ground and the bread baked and the wool spun in the long afternoons. Think of the marriages and the mournings, the naming of children and the burying of the old, the quarrels forgotten by nightfall, the songs whose tunes are gone forever. Not one of their names has come down to us. Not one face, not one voice. They left no writing, for writing has not yet been invented anywhere near here, and will not be for thousands of years more. They are utterly, completely silent. And yet they are not gone, not entirely, for they are still there, in the hill, holding it up. Everything that will ever happen at Knossos, every wonder and every terror to come, will happen upon a foundation these forgotten farmers built with nothing more than their patience and their days. And it is worth pausing, as sleep draws nearer, to sit with that quiet fact. All the grandeur that is coming, the great palace with its 1,000 rooms, the labyrinth of legend, the painted queens and the leaping bulls, the ships that will carry Cretan goods to the edges of the known world, all of it rests, quite literally, on the humble mound these people raised without ever knowing they were raising anything at all. They thought they were only living. They thought they were only building a house on the ruins of the last one, as their parents had done, as their children would. They could not have dreamed what the hill would become. But something is stirring in those slow accumulating centuries, something the diggers of the mud brick houses could not yet see. The little farming village on the hill is growing, and not only upward. Its people are learning, generation by generation, to shape clay and stone with a finer hand, to trade across the water, to gather in greater numbers than a scattered hamlet has ever held. Somewhere in that long, dim stretch of years, the seed of a different kind of place is quietly germinating, a place that will one day astonish the world. What woke it, and how a village of shepherds and grain grinders began, at last, to become something else entirely, is where we must go next. Come back now to the hill, and to the sea that lies beyond it, grey and patient in the early light. The centuries have folded over one another the way waves fold on a shore, and the village of shepherds and grain grinders is still there, still growing, but the world that reaches it from the water has begun, very quietly, to change. Somewhere out past the horizon, in workshops and on beaches you will never see, men have learned to coax a new kind of hardness out of the earth. Copper, first, a soft, ruddy metal that could be hammered into a blade or a pin, and then, more precious still, the pale grey tin that, mixed into the copper in the right small measure, turned it into something else entirely. Bronze. A metal that held an edge, that rang when you struck it, that gleamed in the firelight like a thing half alive. And bronze, unlike stone, could not be simply picked up from the ground beneath your feet. It had to travel. That is the quiet miracle of these years, the ones the scholars call the early Bronze Age, and on Crete the long stretch they name the pre-palatial, the time before the palaces, when the seeds of everything were being sown in soil that did not yet know what it carried. After around 3,000 years before our own era, the little island in the middle of the wine-dark sea began to receive visitors from further and further away. Boats came, low in the water, their hulls heavy with ingots and ideas. Copper from Cyprus, perhaps, that green island named for the metal itself. Tin from somewhere far off and half legendary, carried hand to hand across a chain of harbors no single sailor ever saw the whole of. And with the metal came other things, obsidian, black and glassy, from the island of Melos, fine pottery, beads, the smell of distant ports on the clothes of strangers who spoke in tongues the Cretans did not know. The sea, which had once been a wall around the island, was becoming a road. Imagine what that meant to a people who had lived, for so many generations, turned inward toward their fields and their flocks. Now, on the beaches of the south coast, and along the sheltered inlets where a boat could be drawn up onto the sand, there were things arriving that no farmer's hands had made and no farmer's plot had grown. And someone had to receive them. Someone had to have grain enough, or oil enough, or wool enough, to give in exchange. Not everyone did. And so, without anyone deciding it, without any law or crown to announce it, some families on Crete began, very slowly, to gather more than others. A finer dagger. A string of stone beads. A little seal carved from soft stone, no bigger than a thumbnail, its underside cut with a pattern, a spiral, a lion, a ship, that belonged to one family and no other, so that when it was pressed into wet clay it left a mark that meant this is ours, this is mine. The first small assertions, you might say, of a self that wished to be remembered. And nowhere did that wish take a shape more lasting than in the great plain of the Masara, that broad and fertile lowland in the south of the island, ringed by mountains, warmed by a sun that lingers there long into the evening. It is a gentle country, the Masara, good for grain and good for olives, and the people who lived there in these centuries built for their dead something we still stand inside today, 4,500 years on. Not a grave for one body, cold and solitary. A tomb for a whole people, round, thick-walled, its stones laid in a great circle perhaps 4 or 5 paces across, corbelled inward as it rose so that the walls leaned together toward a roof that has long since fallen away. The archaeologists call them tholos tombs, from the Greek word for a round chamber, and they gathered the bones of the clan together, generation upon generation, inside a single ancestral house of stone. Picture it as those first builders did. A death comes to the village, as death always comes. And the body is carried, wrapped and mourned, across the plain to the round tomb where the grandmothers and the grandfathers already lie. The heavy stone at the low doorway is rolled aside. Inside, in the dimness, are the dead of 100 years, not laid out in tidy rows, for there is no room for that, but resting together, the older bones pushed gently to the sides and back to make space for the new, until in the end the whole clan is mingled there, ancestor with ancestor, no one of them entirely apart from the rest. And with them, small offerings. A clay cup that once held something to ease the long dark journey. A copper blade. A handful of beads. And, in the richest of these tombs, the thing that catches the low light and holds it, gold. The first gold on Crete. Thin little discs stamped with rosettes, meant perhaps to be sewn onto a garment or a shroud. A slender band for a finger. A pendant no larger than a tear. Nothing grand by the measure of the ages that would follow, but the beginning of a language of wealth, spoken in a metal that does not rust, does not tarnish, does not fade. Gold, which says, across the centuries, we were here, and we had more than enough. And here is the quiet, sleeping tension of it all, the thing that stirs beneath the calm surface of these years like a current beneath still water. When you gather the dead of a whole clan into one great tomb, you are saying something about the living. You are saying, we belong together, we are one people, and our claim to this land runs back through all these bones to the very first of us who lies at the bottom of the pile. A tholos tomb is not only a grave. It is a deed of ownership, written in the only ink that lasts, the ink of ancestry. And when one such tomb holds gold, and the next one over, a morning's walk across the plain, holds only clay and copper, then something has entered the world of these gentle farmers that was not there before. A difference. A ranking. The faint, first outline of the idea that some families stand higher than others, that some houses are grander, some seals more often pressed into clay, some daughters married with a richer dowry and some sons buried with a keener blade. No one wrote it down. No one had yet learned to write at all. There was no king in the Masara, no throne, no palace, only round tombs on a wide plain, and villages growing thicker and closer, and the sea bringing its metal and its strangers to the southern shore. But the shape of what was coming was already there, folded small inside these centuries the way the whole of a tree is folded, impossibly, inside a single seed. The wealth was accumulating. The differences were hardening. The seals were multiplying, each one a small insistence on identity and ownership. And somewhere among those thickening villages, in a family grown a little richer and a little prouder than its neighbors, a way of living together was being invented that would need, before very long, something larger than a house to hold it. A gathering place. A center. A stone heart for a people who were becoming, without quite knowing it, a nation. What that center would look like when it finally rose from the earth, how a plain of round tombs and a hill of mud brick houses became the seat of a civilization the world had never seen, is where the story turns next. On the eastern coast, where the land breaks into a scatter of small headlands and the sea slips between them in long blue arms, there was an island so close to the shore that at low tide you could almost imagine wading to it. It was called, in a much later tongue, Moklos, and in these centuries it was not yet anything so grand as a town. It was a cluster of houses on rising ground, their walls of rough stone chinked with clay, their roofs of brushwood and beaten earth, and below them a shelving beach where boats were drawn up out of the reach of the waves. But something was happening in those houses that had not happened before, or not quite in this way, and it happened quietly, by lamplight, in the patient work of hands. For here there were jewelers. Not many, perhaps a handful of families across the whole eastern shore who had learned the secret of it, but enough. Picture one of them at his bench in the last light of the day, a man with a craftsman's stooped shoulders and eyes gone a little short from a lifetime of close looking. Before him lies a leaf of gold so thin it trembles in the draught from the door, so thin that when he lifts it toward the window it glows like something lit from within. He has hammered it himself, tapping and tapping between smooth stones until the metal spread as fine as a petal, and now he cuts from it, with a blade no wider than a blade of grass, the shape of a flower. A daisy, perhaps, or a crocus, its petals splayed. He will make a dozen more, and string them, and they will be buried one day with a woman whose name is already lost to us, laid over her breast so that even in the dark of the tomb she wears a meadow that will never fade. We have found those flowers. They lie in glass cases now, and they are still golden, and they are still impossibly, breathtakingly thin, and the hands that made them have been dust for 4,000 years. He works other wonders too, this man and his few brothers in the craft. He carves. Into ivory brought from who knows where, into soft green steatite and honey-colored stone, he cuts tiny images with tools of harder stone and bow-driven drills, a lion at rest, a spray of leaves, a spider poised at the center of its web, a ship under a fan of oars. These are the seals, the little carved stones that had been multiplying through the villages, and they are becoming, in his hands, no longer merely marks of ownership but small pictures of a world. A world of animals and plants and vessels and gods half glimpsed. To roll one across wet clay is to leave a scene the size of a fingernail, perfect and complete. And people wanted them. They wore them at the wrist and the throat, they pressed them onto the clay stoppers of their storage jars, so that a thing sealed was a thing that belonged to someone, that could not be opened without the owner knowing. In that small insistence, this is mine, this is who I am, you can feel a society beginning to sort itself out, gently, into those who had much to seal and those who had little. And down the coast at Myrtos, on its low sun-baked hill above the southern water, another kind of prosperity was gathering. Here there was no gold to speak of, but there were rooms, dozens of them, small and interconnecting, spilling down the slope like a single great honeycomb of a house shared by everyone who lived there. There were rooms for grinding grain and rooms for pressing oil, rooms stacked with tall jars, a room where a potter shaped his clay, a modest shrine where a little figure of a goddess stood holding a jug against her body. It was a village that worked as one thing, that stored its wealth in common and drew on it in common, and it grew rich in the only currencies that mattered yet, full jars, fat flocks, a surplus that meant no hungry winter. Not palaces. Not kings. Just a slow, comfortable thickening of the good things of life, spread among neighbors who had known one another all their lives. But none of this, not the gold flowers, not the carved seals, not the oil in the great jars, none of it stayed still. This is the part that changes everything, and it changes it so softly you might not notice. The Cretans took to the sea. Not the open, terrifying deep of later legend, but the near sea, the island-hopping sea, where you could go from one blue shape on the horizon to the next and never lose sight of land for long. They built boats long enough to hold a crew and a cargo, and they rowed north into the scattered ring of the Cyclades, those bare and glittering islands that stand in the Aegean like stepping stones laid down by some giant. And they came back carrying things. Obsidian, above all, that black volcanic glass, smooth as water and sharper than any metal edge, which came only from the island of Melos and nowhere else in all that sea. A single blade struck from a core of it could open like a razor, every household wanted it, and only the boats could bring it. And silver, gleaming pale and cold, dug from the veins of other islands. And marble, worked by the Cycladic people into those strange, still figures with folded arms and blank tilted faces that seem to be listening to something we cannot hear. And with the obsidian and the silver and the marble came the other cargo, the invisible one, the one no boat's manifest could ever have listed, ideas. Ways of shaping a pot. Ways of setting a stone. Rumors of how people lived on the other islands, what they built, what they buried, what they believed. Every voyage was a thread, and thread by thread the eastern coast of Crete was being sewn into a wider world, until a jeweler at Moklos might handle in a single week the glass of Melos and the ivory of some far southern shore and the silver of an island he would never see. Feel how it was gathering, then, in these unhurried centuries. Not like a storm, nothing so sudden. Like a tide. Like the way the sea comes up a gentle beach, each small wave reaching a hand's breadth further than the last, so slowly that you can sit and watch it and swear it is not moving at all, and then look up and find the sand where you were sitting gone under water. That was the wealth of early Crete, rising without anyone commanding it to rise, without a crown or a throne or a single name we could point to and call the maker of it. The gold accumulated. The seals multiplied. The boats went out and came back a little heavier each season. The differences between one family and the next widened by the smallest of increments, a jar here, a golden flower there, a finer house on slightly higher ground. And somewhere in all that gentle gathering, something was becoming too large to be held by a house, even the honeycombed, many-roomed house of a place like Myrtos. A wealth that spilled between so many hands, that flowed in from so many islands, needed a place to pool. A center where the oil and the grain and the traded treasures could be gathered, counted, kept, and given out again. On a low green hill far to the south, above a plain scattered with the round stone tombs of the ancestors, that pooling had already, quietly, begun. What rose there, how a hill of ordinary houses became the first great heart of a civilization, and what manner of people first climbed its slope to build something the world had never seen, is where the tide, at last, begins to turn. So climb it with me now, that low green hill above the southern plain, the one the last chapter left you standing beneath, with the round stone tombs of the ancestors scattered across the flat land below like the caps of buried giants. It is somewhere near the year 1900 before the Common Era, though no one living on that hill would know to call it that. They keep their time in harvests, in the flooding of the rains, in the slow procession of stars over the ridgeline. And on this particular hill, the place we will come to call Phaistos, the ordinary houses that have clustered here for generations are, quietly and without announcement, beginning to give way to something else. Something that has never stood upon the earth before. You would not see it happen in a single season. You would see it the way you see a child grow, only by looking away and looking back. A wall leveled here, its old stones carried off. A terrace cut into the slope there, packed with rubble and earth until the hillside itself is coaxed flat, made obedient, turned into a great artificial shelf of ground. And upon that shelf, stone by dressed stone, the builders lay out something with a shape to it. Not a jumble of homes leaning shoulder to shoulder, but a plan. A vast open rectangle of paved court, bright and empty under the sun, and around that emptiness, pressing in on every side, room upon room upon room. This is the thing the archaeologists would one day name a palace, though the word carries more than they mean by it. There is no single king glowering from a throne at the heart of these places, or if there is, he has left us almost nothing of himself. What rises at Phaistos, and at the same slow pace at Knossos on its gentle rise above the northern valley, and at Malia on the flat coast to the east, is stranger and harder to name than a king's house. It is a heart. A place for the gathering in and the giving out of everything a whole society had learned, over those centuries of small increments, to make and to want. Walk in from the court and let your eyes adjust to the cool dimness, and the first thing you would understand is that these buildings were built, in large part, to hold things. Long corridors run back into the western wing, and off them open magazine after magazine, narrow storerooms lined in rows, and standing in those storerooms, taller than a grown man, shoulder to shoulder like a silent congregation, are the pit hoi. The great jars. Bellied vessels of fired clay, so large a child could hide inside one, their sides ribbed with raised bands and pressed with rope patterns, some of them holding many hundreds of liters apiece. And into them flows the wealth of the plain, olive oil, thick and green gold, grain threshed from the surrounding fields, wine, pulses, whatever the land gives up. Sunk into the very floors between the jars are stone-lined pits and cists, more hidden storage still. One building, holding the surplus of thousands of people. You could stand in that corridor and be looking at a year's survival for an entire countryside, sealed in clay, kept in the dark, cool and waiting. And because so much was gathered here, someone had to keep account of it. In small rooms near the stores you would find the earliest marks of it, clay ceilings pressed with carved stone seals, little tokens, and tablets scratched with a script we can look at but cannot read, a writing they made to remember what came in and what went out. This is administration in its infancy, the patient bookkeeping of a civilization learning to count itself. So much oil received, from such a grove. So many jars given out, for such a purpose. The palace was not only a granary. It was a mind, a memory made of clay, trying to hold the whole of the plain inside itself. But it was more than a storehouse and a counting room, and this is the part that unsettles the tidy picture. Move deeper in and you find the workshops, places where potters turned their wheels, where bronze was worked, where fine things were made by skilled hands kept close to the center. And nearer still to the great court, you find rooms that were plainly not for grain or trade at all. Small chambers set apart. Benches of plastered stone. Pits for offerings. Places where something was honored, some presents attended to, in ways we can only glimpse through the objects left behind, the little cups, the figures, the horns of consecration. Storeroom, workshop, treasury, shrine, and hall of gathering, all folded together beneath one sprawling roof, all facing inward toward that one bright open court. Whatever these places were for, they were for everything at once. They were where the material and the sacred and the practical business of a whole people were kept in the same embrace. And here is the question that should keep you turning it over as the dark settles around you. What power draws a whole society to build on such a scale, all at roughly the same moment, on three separate hills across a single island? To level the old homes of your grandparents, to move that weight of stone, to feed and organize the hundreds of hands it takes to raise a thing this large, that is not the work of a village drifting along. That is a vision, held and imposed and believed in, by someone or something with the authority to gather a people's labor and point it all in one direction. And yet we do not know their names. We do not know whether it was a priest, a chief, a family, a council, or a faith. We know only the shape of what they built, and that the same idea seized three places at once, as though it were in the air itself. But there is one more thing about these first palaces, and it is the thing that grows stranger the longer you sit with it. Go back out to the edge of the great complex, to where the rooms give way to the open country and the tombs on the plain below. And look for the wall. Not the wall of the rooms, the other wall. The rampart. The ditch. The gate that can be barred, the tower that can be manned, the high circuit of stone that every wealthy town in every other corner of the ancient world threw up around itself the moment it had anything worth taking. Look for the fortifications. You will not find them. Here is a building holding the concentrated wealth of an entire region, jars of oil worth a fortune, storerooms of grain, workshops of bronze and gold, the treasure and the memory of a people, and it sits open to the hills. No defensive walls worth the name. No fortress crouch. The palace does not hunker down against a threatening world, it opens its arms to a court and lets the light pour in. On an island in a violent age, the people who built the first great houses of Europe apparently did not expect to be attacked. Or did not fear it. Or knew something that made walls seem beside the point. What was it that let them sleep so easy, unguarded, with so much to lose? What kept the sea lanes gentle and the neighbors friendly, and let a whole civilization pour its riches into open halls beneath an open sky? The answer lies out on the water, in the ships that were already slipping between the islands, and in a kind of power the world had not yet seen, one that guards a coastline without ever raising a single wall. But that is a tide for another night. Come with me now, up from the harbor and along a gentle road, into the low hills where the greatest of the great houses waited. Knossos. Say the name softly and it almost sounds like a sigh. By the time you reach it, the sun has climbed high, and the white stone of the walls throws back the light so warmly that you might raise a hand to shade your eyes. There is no gate to challenge you. No sentry asks your business. You simply walk in, the way water finds its way into a shell, drawn by the openness of the place, and the first thing that greets you is space, a great open rectangle of paving, wide as a village green, ringed on every side by walls that rise 2 and 3 stories into the blue. This is the central court, the still heart around which the whole vast house is arranged, and everything the Minoans built, they built to hold this emptiness at its center. Stand a moment in that court and feel how it gathers you in. The paving beneath your sandals is smooth, laid with care, worn faint by the passage of countless feet before yours. Around you the walls are not grim and grey but painted, ochre and crimson, and that particular deep blue the Minoans loved, the blue of a kingfisher's back, of deep water at noon. The court is oriented with the seasons in mind, so that on certain mornings the rising sun spills straight down its length, and on certain evenings the last light lingers on the western walls long after the corridors behind them have gone to shadow. Here, we think, the ceremonies unfolded. Here crowds may have gathered on the surrounding terraces and stairways to watch processions of robed figures bearing offerings, dancers, and perhaps the famous leaping of the bulls, that breathless dance with a charging animal that the frescoes remember and no one has quite explained. The court was theatre and temple and gathering place all at once, a stage open to the sky where a whole people could see itself made visible. But step off that bright stage, in through one of the many doorways, and the palace changes character entirely. Now you are in the maze. This is the thing that everyone who ever walked here remarked upon, and the thing that would echo down the centuries in story. Knossos does not lay itself out in straight, obedient lines. It coils. It branches. Corridors turn and turn again, opening into small rooms and then larger ones, doubling back, climbing half a flight of stairs only to descend another. There are hundreds of chambers, storerooms, workshops, shrines, living quarters, magazines, packed together in a dense and beautiful confusion. A stranger could lose themselves here in a heartbeat, and perhaps that was partly the point. To move through Knossos with confidence was to belong to it. The building itself knew its own people. And here is the quiet genius of it, the thing you feel before you understand it. A house this deep, this folded in upon itself, ought to be dark at its core, airless, a warren of gloom. It is not. The Minoan builders had learned a trick the world would half forget and rediscover only much later. They cut wells of light down through the stories, open shafts that carried the daylight from the roof all the way to the lowest rooms, so that even in the innermost parts of the palace you are never far from a soft, falling brightness. Beside these light wells they set columns, and Minoan columns are strange and lovely things, broader at the top than at the base, tapering downward, painted red or black, so they seem less to hold the roof up than to hang gently from it. Stand in one of those light wells at midday and watch the sun come down in a slow, dust-flecked shaft, warming a small square of the floor, and you understand that these people did not fear the dark so much as they simply refused to live in it. Air moved through here too, drawn along the shafts, so the deep rooms breathed. It is cool in summer, this labyrinth, and it holds warmth in winter. Somewhere close by, clay pipes ran beneath the floors, carrying clean water in and waste water out, a plumbing so quietly advanced that those who dug it up thousands of years later could scarcely believe the date. Follow the corridors down now, toward the west of the palace, and you come to the long magazines, the storerooms. And here the true nature of the place reveals itself, in row upon row of enormous clay jars. The Minoans called them pithoi, and they stand taller than a child, some taller than a grown man, their bellies swollen and ringed with raised bands and rope-like decoration so that many hands could grip and maneuver them. They line the narrow rooms in their dozens, in their hundreds, and set into the floors between them are stone-lined pits, cists, for storing yet more. What did they hold? Oil, first of all, the golden olive oil that was the lifeblood of this whole world, pressed from groves that carpeted the island. And grain, wheat and barley, poured in and sealed against the mice and the damp. Wine. Honey. Dried figs and pulses. Count the jars, reckon the volume they could hold, and the arithmetic is staggering. The storerooms of Knossos could keep fed not a family, not a household, but thousands of people, a small city's worth of bellies through a lean winter or a failed harvest. This is why the palace was built as it was. It was a granary the size of a town, a great communal larder, the place where the surplus of a whole fertile island flowed in to be counted, stored, and given out again. Power here was not measured in walls or spears. It was measured in jars. And over all of it, watching from wall and pillar and doorway, hung a single sign, carved and painted so often that you cannot walk 10 paces without meeting it again. A double axe. 2 blades set back to back on a single haft, symmetrical, curved like the wings of a butterfly at rest. The Minoans called it, or so we believe from the later Greek word that preserved it, the labyrinths. You find it incised into the great stone blocks of the building, so deeply and so often in certain rooms that those chambers must have been sacred. You find it small and golden among the offerings, and vast and gleaming in the frescoes, held aloft in ceremony. It was not, as far as anyone can tell, a weapon of war. No skeleton bears its mark, no battle scene displays it. It was something else, an emblem of the divine, bound up with the goddess who seems to have stood at the center of Minoan faith, perhaps a tool of sacrifice, perhaps simply the signature of the holy itself, stamped upon the stones to say, this place belongs to the powers above. And from that word, labyrinths, some have traced the very name of the maze that so bewildered visitors. The house of the double axe. The labyrinth. So this is what they made, these people of the open court and the falling light, a building that fed a nation and worshipped a goddess and staged the great moments of a people's life, all under one endlessly folding roof, all watched over by the sign of the axe. It hums with a serene and settled confidence, a certainty that the harvests would come and the jars would fill and the seasons turn as they always had. And yet a house like this, so rich and so unguarded, so full of oil and grain and gold, does not simply arise from good soil and good weather. Something fed it. Something out beyond the storerooms and the painted walls made all this abundance possible, a wealth that came not from the fields alone but from far off, across the water, carried home in the holds of ships. And to understand how the people of the double axe grew so rich that they could pour it all into open halls, we must leave the palace behind, and go down at last to the harbors, and out onto the wine-dark sea. For all its splendor, Knossos was never alone. To imagine the island as a single great house with a single great hall would be to mistake the part for the whole, for Crete in those centuries was a land of many courts, and if you had walked its length in the cool of a spring morning you would have crossed from the shadow of one palace into the orbit of another, and then another, each with its own painted rooms and its own crowded storerooms, each humming with the same unhurried confidence you had felt beneath the sign of the axe. So let us leave the northern hill behind for a while, and travel out across the island, and visit the sisters. Go south first, up and over the spine of mountains, until the land falls away into the wide and golden plain of the Masara, the richest farmland on all of Crete. There, on a long low ridge that catches the wind, stood Phaistos, and even now, when only its foundations remain, you can feel why they built it there. The view is enormous. To the north rise the pale slopes of Mount Ida, snow-capped late into the year. To the south the ground rolls gently down toward the distant sea. The builders of Phaistos loved the horizon. They laid a great ceremonial staircase, broad and shallow, so that a person climbing it seemed to rise slowly into the sky, and they opened their western court to the light so that the whole plain lay spread before it like an offering. It was a palace made for looking outward, for standing at the top of the steps in the long evening and watching the shadows of the mountains reach across the grain. Its storerooms brimmed as Knossos did, its potters turned out vessels so fine and so thin-walled that we still marvel at them, cups you could almost see the lamplight through. And somewhere in its rooms, pressed into a disk of soft clay and fired hard, a spiral of stamped symbols was set down that no one has ever read, and perhaps no one ever will. But that is a puzzle for another night. For now it is enough to picture Phaistos at dusk, breathing out the warmth of its stones, its people drifting home along the field paths below. Now turn and go north again, down to the sea on the island's other shoulder, to a place the wind never quite leaves alone. This is Malia, set almost upon the shore, on a flat coastal shelf where the land meets the water without ceremony. Malia has a different feeling altogether. Where Phaistos gazes and Knossos rambles, Malia sprawls low and open under a huge bright sky, its stones are soft honey gold, salt on the air, the sea murmuring a few hundred paces off. It was a working place, a place of trade and craft and traffic, and the sea was its livelihood. Here the archaeologists found the things that men make when they are rich and want the world to know it, a bronze sword with a crystal pommel, and, most famous of all, a pendant of 2 golden bees curved together over a drop of honey, so delicate, so perfectly wrought, that it seems less made than grown. Malia had its own great court, its own pillared halls, its own strange stone with round hollows carved into it, perhaps for offerings of first fruits or oil. And all around the palace lay the houses of a real town, close-packed lanes, and workshops and courtyards. Ordinary lives lived hard against the edge of the water, watching the horizon for sails. And then, if you have the heart for a longer road, go east, far east, to the very end of the island, where the mountains crowd down to the sea and the land runs out. Here, in a sheltered bay looking toward the sunrise, stood Zakros, the smallest of the great palaces and the most remote, and in some ways the most precious of all. For Zakros was never dug over by later builders, never robbed clean in the centuries between. When the archaeologists came to it at last, they found its rooms very nearly as the final day had left them. And what they found tells us what Zakros was for. It was a gateway. Tucked in that far eastern corner, it was the last Cretan harbor a ship would leave before turning south across the open water toward Egypt and the coasts of the Levant, and the first it would reach coming home. In its treasury lay things that had traveled, elephant tusks from Syria, copper ingots stamped and stacked, and vessels of stone so fine they take the breath away, a jug carved in the shape of a bull's head, a rock crystal cup with a handle of crystal beads on a bronze thread, a great ceremonial vase cut from banded stone in the likeness of a mountain peak crowned with wild goats and shrines. These were not the goods of a sleepy backwater. Zakros was a customs house and a warehouse and a shrine all at once, a place where the wider world came ashore. 3 palaces, then, and there were others besides, Galatas rising later on its own hill, Petra's keeping watch in the east, small courts and villas scattered through the valleys, each a lesser echo of the great halls. And here is the thing to hold in your mind as you drift, they were not strangers to one another. They shared a way of building, courts oriented to the same points of the sky, storerooms of the same tall jars, the same graceful script scratched onto the same little tablets. They shared gods, or at least the same signs of them, the horns, the double axe, the goddess with her arms raised. They were rivals, surely, proud of their own harvests and their own harbors, and perhaps in the deep past they had warred, but by the height of their days they had settled into something more like a family of houses, related and distinct, prosperous and at ease. So picture, as sleep gathers, the roads and the water that held them together. Picture a runner setting out from Phaistos at first light with a sealed lump of clay in his satchel, jogging the mountain track toward Knossos, his shadow long on the stones. Picture the paved ways the Minoans laid across their island, real roads with curbs and drains and little guard posts along them, so that goods and messages could move from court to court in a single day. And picture the boats above all, the low-painted ships slipping along the coast from Malia to Zakras and back, their holds heavy with oil and wine and folded cloth, hugging the shore where they could, standing out to sea where they must, threading the whole island together with wakes of foam. On any given morning the water between the palaces was alive with them, small sails leaning to the wind, and the men aboard knew every headland and every hidden rock as you know the turnings of your own street. It was, in its quiet way, a single world. One people, one script, one settled peace, spread across 100 miles of mountain and plain and shore, stitched together by feet and hooves and keels. And yet all of it, the courts, the treasuries, the golden bees and the crystal cups, the very roads themselves, rested upon something that lay beyond the island's edge, out where the runners could not go and the coastal boats dared not follow. For the wealth that filled these halls did not come from Crete alone. It came from further off, from voyages long and dangerous, from harbors in Egypt and Cyprus and the smoking isles to the north. And the ships that made those crossings, and the men who sailed them, and the far shores where they traded, that is the story that made all the rest of it possible, and the one we have not yet dared to follow out onto the open sea. Tonight, let us come down from the great courts, down from the bright halls with their fluted pillars and their frescoed dolphins, and walk instead along a narrow lane on a hillside above the northern sea. There is a town here, small and steep, and it has waited a very long time to be found. For nearly 35 centuries it lay quiet beneath the earth and the wild time, until one morning in the year 1901 a young American woman came over the ridge on the back of a mule and saw, in the turned soil of a farmer's field, the faint grey lines of walls. Her name was Harriet Boyd, later Harriet Boyd Hawes, and she was one of the first women ever to lead an excavation of her own. Where the men of her age had chased palaces and gold, she chose instead to lift the roof off an ordinary place, and to ask a quieter question, not how the kings lived, but how everyone else did. The place she uncovered we now call Gournia, though we do not know its true name. That name is one of the many the sea has erased. Come, then, and let the town assemble itself around you as the excavators found it. Imagine a low hill sloping down toward a sheltered bay, and threading up and across its flanks a web of little cobbled lanes, so narrow in places that two people carrying baskets would have to turn sideways to pass. These are real streets, still there, still paved with the same water-worn stones that Bronze Age feet pressed smooth. They climb in shallow steps, they bend around outcrops of rock, they knit the whole hillside together into a single close-packed knot of houses, perhaps 60 of them, maybe more, their walls of rough stone below and mud brick above, their flat roofs serving as terraces where a family might sleep on the hottest nights. There is a paved public square, and near the crown of the hill a small building grander than the rest, a little governor's house, a palace in miniature, as though someone here answered, in the end, to Knossos far to the west. But we will not go up there tonight. Tonight we stay among the ordinary doors. Choose one of them. A house near the middle of the town, its threshold a single long slab of stone, worn into a gentle hollow by the crossing of many years. Step over it, and let the day begin. It is not yet fully light. In the first grey of the morning a woman kneels at the hearth, feeding dry twigs to embers she banked the night before, coaxing them back to a small clear flame. She sets a shallow clay pan to heat, and beside her, on a stone quern still gritty with yesterday's use, she has already begun to grind the barley, pushing the upper stone back and forth, back and forth, until the grain gives up its coarse pale flour. There is a rhythm to it, old and patient, the sound of it repeated in 100 houses up and down the hill at the same hour, a soft grinding music beneath the waking town. The bread she bakes will be flat and dense and dark, and it will smell, as it browns, the way bread has smelled in every human dwelling for 10,000 years. That smell is perhaps the one thing you would recognize at once, if you could truly stand in her doorway, the thing that would tell you, without a word of a language you cannot speak, that you were home. Around her the house holds its small economy. In one corner, set into the floor, are the great storage jars, the pit hoy, taller than a child, their bellies full of oil and grain and dried beans against the leaner months. Against the wall leans a loom, 2 upright posts and a crossbeam, and hanging from it a curtain of warp threads pulled straight by rows of clay loom weights, dozens of them, each pierced and shaped by hand. We know these weights well, for the excavators found them where they fell, tumbled in little heaps when the wooden beams rotted away, still keeping the ghost of the vanished cloth. Here a daughter will spend the long light of the day passing the weft across, thread by thread, her fingers doing what her mother's fingers did and her grandmother's before her, making the wool that clothes them and, beyond that, the cloth that the town will trade, for Gournia was a working place, and much of what it made was made to be sent away. For this was no village of farmers only. Go back out into the lane and follow it down, and you pass the open fronts of the workshops, and here is the true wonder of the place. In one, a potter's forming table and the tools of his trade, left as if he had only stepped out for water. In another, the litter of a carpenter, chisels, awls, a saw. And in several, unmistakably, the leavings of the smith, crucibles crusted with the memory of molten bronze, stone molds cut precisely to shape, the small anvils, the scatter of finished things, chisels and awls and fishhooks and long bronze nails and the wicked curved blades of sickles. A whole street of them, so many that some who dug here felt they had found a town that lived by its hands, that took in raw copper and tin brought up from the harbour and sent out tools and blades to the farms and the fishing boats of the whole eastern end of the island. The palaces dreamed in gold, Gournia worked in bronze, and the work of Gournia was the sinew that held the dream upright. And down at the foot of the hill, where the lanes at last run out onto the shingle, is the reason the town is here at all, the sea, and the boats drawn up on it. The men of Gournia were fishermen as much as anything, and the things they left behind say so plainly, the bronze hooks, the stone weights that once dragged the hems of their nets down into the cold clear water, the shells of the shellfish they gathered along the rocks. In the evening the boats come back low in the water, and the catch is carried up the steps in dripping baskets, and somewhere a net is spread across a doorway to dry, and a boy is set to picking the tangles and the weed from its meshes while the light goes soft and gold over the bay. And when the meal is eaten and the lamps are lit, small clay lamps, each with its little pinch lip to hold the wick, burning the same olive oil that fed them, the family turns, before sleep, to the last small thing. For in the corner of the house, or on a low shelf, there is a shrine. Nothing grand, a little clay figure of the goddess with her arms upraised, and beside her the modelled shapes of horns, and perhaps a snake curled about her, and a shallow dish for a few grains, a drop of oil, a flower gone brown at the edges. The same great powers that were worshipped in the pillared crypts of the palaces were worshipped here too, at the scale of a single kneeling household, by the light of a single flame. The empire, in the end, was this, not the frescoes and the treasuries, but a woman banking her fire, a girl at her loom, a man mending his net, all of them under the eye of the little goddess with her open hands. They slept, and rose, and ground the barley again. Season upon season, the smoke rose from the roofs of Gournia and the smiths' hammers rang and the boats went out and came back. It felt, surely, as such lives always feel, as though it would simply go on. But it did not go on. Something came to Gournia, as it came to all the towns of this coast, and when it had passed the lanes were empty and the looms lay fallen and the little goddess kept her watch over no one at all. What that something was, fire, or wave, or a darkness we have not yet named, is a question we must carry with us a while longer, down toward the shore, and out onto the water where the answer waits. The sea, then. We have lingered long among the courtyards and storerooms, among the painted walls and the narrow lanes of the little towns, and all the while there has been another Crete waiting just beyond the doorways, the Crete that faced outward, toward the water. For everything you have seen so far, the oil in its great jars, the copper poured into molds, the saffron gathered on Thera's cliffs, meant nothing unless it could move. And on Crete, things moved by sea. The island sits like a long stone breakwater across the mouth of the Aegean, a threshold between the world of the Greek mainland to the north and the older kingdoms of Egypt and the Levant to the south and east. To hold Crete was to hold the doorway. And the Minoans, it seems, understood this before anyone else did. Centuries later, when the historian Thucydides sat down in Athens to explain how power had first come into the Greek world, he reached back past all the wars he knew, past even the songs of Troy, to a memory older than memory. Minos, he wrote, using the name the Greeks gave to the lords of Knossos, was the first of whom we know by report to have possessed a navy. He made himself master of the sea, cleared it of pirates so far as he could, and planted his own sons as governors in the islands. A thalassocracy, the word would later be, a rule not of land but of water. Whether there was ever one king named Minos, or whether the name simply stood for a long line of sea lords, we cannot say. But Thucydides was reaching, across 1,000 years of darkness, toward something real. The Greeks remembered that once, before them, someone had owned the sea. And the someone was on Crete. Picture the ships, then, for they are the heart of it. Not the towering vessels of later ages, but long, low, open craft, their hulls dark with pitch, driven by rows of oars that rose and fell in a slow, patient rhythm and by a single broad sail of linen when the wind was kind. On the walls of Thera, in the little town buried under ash, someone painted a whole fleet of them, and so we are not guessing, we can see them, sterns curved high like the necks of birds, decked with garlands and cabins of woven reed, gliding between one harbor and another while dolphins arc through the painted water alongside. These were the workhorses of the empire, and they carried the wealth of Crete outward, the fine oil in its stoppered jars, the wine, the folded textiles dyed in colors the mainland could not make, and above all the pottery, those elegant painted cups and jugs with their swirling octopuses and lilies and running spirals, so admired that men in distant places wanted them not merely to use but to own, the way one owns a beautiful thing. And where the pots went, the Minoans went with them. This is the strange and quiet genius of their sea power, that it left almost no fortresses, almost no battlefields, and yet its fingerprints lie all across the Aegean. On the little island of Kythera, off the southern tip of the Greek mainland, archaeologists found a settlement that was not Greek at all but Cretan through and through, Minoan pottery, Minoan tools, Minoan ways of worship, laid down generation after generation on a hilltop called Castri. It was, so far as we can tell, a genuine colony, a piece of Crete transplanted onto foreign soil, the first stepping stone on the long sea road north. Whoever lived there ate from Cretan bowls, prayed in the Cretan manner, and looked back, surely, toward the great island over the horizon as home. Northward the road ran on, to Thera itself, that ring of cliffs around a drowned volcano, where the town we call Akrotiri grew rich and cosmopolitan under the Minoan influence, its houses several stories tall, its walls bright with frescoes, its people drinking from Cretan cups and worshipping, it seems, Cretan gods, though they were not themselves Cretans but islanders who had fallen into Crete's warm and coloring orbit. Eastward the road reached toward Rhodes, and beyond it to the coast of Anatolia, that great flank of Asia where a place called Miletus, in later ages a famous Greek city, began its life with a quarter of Minoan settlers making their pots in the Cretan style, so far from home, on the edge of a foreign land. And southward, always southward, the ships pressed on toward Egypt, where the painters of Pharaoh's court drew foreign envoys paying tribute, tall men with slender waists and long dark curls, carrying tall vessels of Cretan shape, and labeled them, in the careful hieroglyphs, as the people of Keftio, the men of the great green in the midst of the sea. This was the shape of the empire, and it is worth pausing over how unlike an empire it was. There were no marching armies that we can find, no lines drawn across the map, no walls thrown up to keep a conquered people down. The Minoan dominion was not measured in borders but in harbors, in the safe coves and beaching grounds strung out along the sea lanes, each one a little farther from Crete, each one a place where a captain could pull his ship up onto the sand for the night, mend a cracked oar, take on fresh water, trade a jar of oil for a bag of grain, and sleep under the same stars he had slept under at home. Power, for them, was not a territory you held but a route you kept open. It was the confidence that a ship setting out from Knossos in the spring could thread its way, harbor by friendly harbor, all the way to the Nile and back before the autumn storms closed the sea, and come home heavier than it left. In an age when the water was the only road and every road was dangerous, that confidence was itself a kind of kingdom, invisible, unfortified, and for a long season unchallenged. And so the barley grew and was ground, as we have seen, in the little towns, and the smiths hammered their bronze, and down at the water's edge the ships went out and came back, tracing and retracing the same slow lines across the Aegean until the lines themselves became a habit of the world, a thing everyone simply knew, that the sea belonged, in some quiet unspoken way, to the people of Crete. It must have seemed as fixed as the coastline, as permanent as the pattern of the winds. The men of Kythera and Miletus and Akrotiri lived their whole lives inside it and never imagined its ending, any more than the girl at her loom in Gournia imagined the emptying of her lane. But a sea empire has a weakness that a land empire does not, and it lies in the very thing that makes it strong. A kingdom of harbors has no walls to fall back behind. Its power floats. It rests upon the assumption that the ships will always sail, that the routes will always hold, that the water between one friendly cove and the next will stay open and calm and free. Take that away, silence the harbors, break the ships, or turn the gentle sea itself into something that no fleet can cross, and there is nothing left to defend, and nothing left to defend it with. The Minoans had built their greatness upon the water. And the water, patient and enormous and utterly indifferent, was about to remember that it had never truly belonged to anyone at all. For out on the ring of cliffs at Thera, beneath the bright painted town and the garlanded ships and the drowsing quiet of a summer that felt like all the summers before it, the mountain was beginning, very slowly, to stir. Tonight, let the mountain wait. Let it hold its breath a little longer in the dark, and turn your mind instead to the warm south, to a river wider and slower than any the Cretans knew, and to a people who watched the ships of Keftio come sliding up the delta with wonder in their eyes. Keftio. That was the name the Egyptians gave them, or gave the place they came from, or a word written in the careful little pictures of the scribes, sounded out across 3,500 years so softly that we can no longer be certain how it was spoken. Keftio. The great green island in the middle of the sea, out past the mouths of the Nile, past the last reeds and the last fishermen, where the water turned deep and the known world ended. To an Egyptian standing on the shore of the delta, Crete was not quite real. It was the far edge of things, a rumor with a coastline, a kingdom you reached only by trusting yourself to the open water for days, and the Egyptians, for all their glory, were never truly a people of the open sea. They loved their river. They understood the river. The sea beyond was another matter, and the men who crossed it lightly, who came and went as though the horizon were merely a road, seemed to them touched by something strange and enviable. And so they painted them. In the hills above Thebes, on the western bank where the dead were laid in tombs cut deep into the rock, the great officials of Egypt had their walls covered in scenes of everything that made their lives magnificent, the hunts, the harvests, the banquets, the endless streams of foreigners bringing the wealth of the wider world to lay at Pharaoh's feet. And there, among the Nubians with their gold and the Syrians with their horses, walk the men of Keftio. You can still see them, faded but unmistakable, in the tomb of a vizier named Rekhmire, in the tombs of others whose names have half worn away. Slender men, long dark hair falling in curls down their backs, cinched at the waist and bare above it, wearing the kilt and the codpiece and the soft patterned boots that no Egyptian wore. They come in procession, single file, and in their hands they carry the things that mark them out to all the world. Cups. Tall vessels of gold and silver shaped into the heads of bulls, the horns curving up and the nostrils flared, the very writer whose broken cousins have been dug from the ruins of Knossos. Ingots of copper, cast in that curious shape like a stretched hide, an oxide flattened out, heavy as a sin, each one a small fortune in raw metal. Jars of a pattern the Egyptians clearly found beautiful, painted in spirals and running waves, always the waves, always the sea coiling across the surface of everything the Cretans touched. The scribes labeled the scene in their neat columns, the coming of the chiefs of Kephala, bearing the produce of their lands, bringing peace, bowing before the majesty of the king. Tribute, the Egyptians called it, because that was the only frame their pride allowed. Everything flowed toward Pharaoh, everything was gift and homage. But you and I, drifting here in the dark, can see it more plainly for what it likely was. Trade. Exchange. The give and take of two proud powers, each dressing the transaction in the language most flattering to itself. The bull cup went south, something Egyptian went north, and everyone went home content, and told the story their own way. Rest on that a moment, the sheer reach of it. A cup hammered by a smith on a hill in Crete, carried down to a harbor, loaded onto a ship, borne across days of empty blue, unloaded in the delta, walked up the river, and finally raised in the painted hand of a dead man's portrait in the cliffs of Thebes, where it has waited in the silent dark for us to find it. The Bronze Age was not a scatter of little kingdoms each alone behind its walls. It was a web, loose, salt-stained, humming with movement, and Crete sat near the center of the western strands of it, admired and slightly mysterious to everyone who traded with her. And the Egyptians did more than paint the Cretans. In one astonishing place, it seems the Cretans painted for the Egyptians. Down in the eastern delta, at a place the Egyptians called Avaris, its ruins buried now under a mound called Tel El Dabeh, archaeologists working in the soft delta soil found something that stopped them in their tracks. Fragments of plaster. Thousands of them, tumbled and shattered, painted in colors and techniques that had no business being there. Because they were not Egyptian at all. They were Minoan. On the wall of a palace beside the Nile, someone had painted bulls, great charging bulls, and slim acrobats vaulting over their backs, hands to the horns, bodies arced in the air, exactly as they leapt across the walls of Knossos far away. The same running spirals. The same half-rosette borders. The same red-brown skin and impossible grace. The very fresco that says Crete more than any other, the bull leap, found flaking off a wall in the wrong country entirely. Nobody is entirely sure how it got there, and that uncertainty is part of the pleasure of it. Perhaps a marriage, a Cretan princess sent south to a pharaoh's household, homesick, wanting the walls of home around her. Perhaps a gift of artists, craftsmen lent from one court to another the way a great lord might lend a prized musician. Perhaps simply the fashion of a moment, when to have your palace painted in the Cretan manner was to announce to every visitor that you were connected, worldly, plugged into the glittering network of the sea. Whatever the reason, it means that Minoan hands, or hands trained in the Minoan way, mixed their plaster and ground their pigments and raised their brushes on the banks of the Nile, and left behind the leaping bull as a signature no one could mistake. So picture the world as it stood in those bright centuries. Down in Egypt, the pharaohs and their scribes, certain of their own centrality, receiving the chiefs of Kephala with their bull-head cups. Up the Levantine coast, at Ugarit and Byblos and a dozen bustling ports, the merchant kings weighing copper and tin and cedar and dye, their warehouses stacked with goods from every shore. Out in the islands, the traders of the Aegean threading between them all. And in the middle of it, unwalled, unworried, wealthy beyond the dreams of its neighbors, the great green island itself, sending out its painted jars and its curling frescoes and its acrobats and its oil, and taking in gold and ivory and ostrich eggs and the small luxuries of 100 distant lands. Crete was known everywhere and understood nowhere. Even to the mightiest empire on earth she was a name at the edge of the map, a people who came out of the sunset over the water and returned into it, leaving behind only the loveliest of things. It was a marvelous position to hold. To be everyone's partner and no one's threat. To be admired, courted, imitated on palace walls a sea away. To have your ships trusted in every harbor from the Delta to the Northern Isles, and to need no army, because you had something better than an army, you had the routes, and the routes were open, and the whole warm rich machinery of exchange turned smoothly on the quiet assumption that it always would. But every web depends on the strands that hold it. And far to the north of the Delta, north of Crete herself, the strand that carried more Aegean traffic than any other ran past a single ring of cliffs rising sheer from the sea, the island the traders knew as one more friendly cove on the way home. They had no reason to look at it twice. They had no way of knowing that of all the places their ships passed, this was the one that would decide everything. Let the ships sail on for a while without us. Let the routes lie quiet under the moon, and turn instead to the walls, because the Minoans left us something rarer than trade goods, rarer than gold. They left us pictures of themselves. And these are the only voices we have, from a people whose words we cannot read. You must understand what a strange gift this is. Their writing survives, pressed into clay tablets, that looping, delicate script the scholars call Linear A. We have hundreds of these tablets. We can see the shapes of the signs, count them, trace them with a fingertip across 3,500 years. And we cannot read a single word. No bilingual stone was ever found to unlock them, no Rosetta key. So the language of Crete stays sealed, its poems and prayers and account lists all locked behind a door with no handle. The Minoans are the great silence at the heart of the Bronze Age, a civilization that spoke, and sang, and named its children, and whose speech dissolved completely into the dark. Except on the walls. There, they did not write. There, they painted. And paint, it turns out, needs no translation. Picture the plaster while it is still wet. This is the method the Italians would later call buon fresco, true fresco, though the Minoans were doing it 1,000 years before Rome was a village of huts. The painter spreads a fine skin of lime plaster across the wall, and works fast, because the surface is drying even as the brush moves. The pigment sinks into the damp lime and, as the wall cures, the two become one substance. The color is not laid on the wall. It becomes the wall. It breathes with it. That is why these images have lasted when almost everything else has gone. The paint is not a coat that can flake away, it is part of the stone's own body. When you look at a Minoan fresco, you are looking at a moment the wall itself remembers. And what did they choose to remember? Not conquest. Not kings enthroned over piles of enemy dead, the sort of thing that fills the walls of Egypt and Assyria, all those stiff processions of tribute and slaughter. Look along the corridors of Knossos, or into the buried rooms of the towns, and you find something almost unbearably gentle. You find the natural world, painted by people who plainly loved it. There are dolphins, a whole pod of them, curving through a blue that is bluer than any real sea, their bellies pale, their backs dark, and around them the little darting shapes of smaller fish, as if the wall had been dipped straight into the Aegean. There are lilies, red lilies, growing in clusters against a warm field of ochre, each petal turned back with a flick of the brush. There are crocuses, saffron crocuses, the precious flower whose threads were worth a fortune, being gathered by girls who kneel among the rocks, reaching into the blossoms with careful fingers. There are swallows in the air above them, and the rocks themselves rise in soft, undulating bands of red and blue and cream, less like geology than like something dreamed. And there are the monkeys. Blue monkeys. This is the detail that stops you when you first meet it, because there were no monkeys on Crete, not then, not ever, running wild. These are creatures from Egypt, from the lands up the great river, from beyond. Someone had seen them. Someone had watched them scramble and leap, and had carried that watching home across the water and set it loose across a wall, painting the animals a rich, unreal blue, clambering through crocus fields, tails curling, one of them reaching up as though startled by a bird. A blue monkey on a Cretan wall is a whole voyage folded into a single image. It is the trade routes made visible. It says, "We went out, and we saw the world, and we brought its wonders back to look at while we slept." Notice how everything moves. That is the thing the eye keeps returning to. Egyptian figures stand square and eternal, facing forward through 10,000 years without ever shifting their weight. Minoan figures are caught mid-gesture, bending, running, turning, leaping. There is a famous scene of a bull and slender acrobats vaulting clean over its back, one grasping the horns, one arced upside down above the spine, one landing behind, the whole impossible dance held in a single frame, alive with risk and grace. Whatever it meant, ritual, sport, some rite we will never fully understand, it was painted by someone who cared, more than anything, about the feeling of the body in flight. And the people. The women, especially, painted with such attention that you feel you could name them. Their skin is rendered pale, a convention, a code that marked them as women, the way the men were painted red-brown from the sun. Their eyes are large and dark, lined and deliberate, gazing out or aside with an expression that is somehow both formal and utterly present. Their black hair falls in long ringlets, threaded sometimes with beads, curling against the cheek. And their clothes, the clothes are extraordinary. Skirts that fall in tier after tier of flounces, layered like the petals of some great flower, patterned and bordered and edged. Bodices open and close-fitting. Jewelry at the throat and wrist. One figure, found far to the north on that same island of cliffs, is so poised and knowing that her finders called her simply La Parisienne, the Parisian, because across 3,500 years she still looked, to them, like a woman dressed for an evening she intended to enjoy. There is joy in these walls. That is not a sentimental word to use, it is, quite simply, what the evidence shows. A people painted what they treasured, and what they treasured was the flowering of the world, the leap of a fish, the saffron in the rock, the turn of a girl's wrist as she picked it, the strange blue animal from over the sea. Weapons appear, of course, they were not innocent of war, no one is. But war is not what they chose to keep. War is not what they wanted on the walls where they lived and dreamed and raised their children. They wanted the crocus and the dolphin and the swallow. They wanted grace. And so when we say we cannot read the Minoans, it is only half true. We cannot read their sentences. But we can read their loves. We can stand in front of a wall that has held its color since before the Trojan War, before Moses, before almost anything we call ancient, and we can see, plainly, what delighted them, and it is very nearly the same as what delights us. A flower. A leaping fish. A friend's dark eyes. The whole warm surface of a life lived close to the sea, in the sun, without much fear. Which is what makes the walls, in the end, so quietly frightening. Because these paintings are not only records of what the Minoans saw. Some of them are records of the very last thing they saw. On that island to the north, the ring of cliffs the traders passed without a second glance, there are rooms where the frescoes are complete, unbroken, still bright, still breathing. Whole houses of them, sealed and perfect. And they are perfect for one reason only. No one ever came back to change them. No later hand ever painted over the crocus girls or repaired the swallows. The wall stopped at a single morning and held there, exactly, forever. Something buried them. Something so sudden and so total that a town of painted rooms was pressed flat and preserved beneath it, like a flower shut inside a book, and the people who had gathered the saffron and watched the blue monkeys walked out of their doors, one ordinary day, and never walked back in. For now, let us step back from that buried morning, and turn our eyes to something warmer, a wall in the great house at Knossos, where the plaster has held one impossible instant for 3,500 years. It is perhaps the most famous image the Minoans ever left us, and it is worth arriving at slowly, the way you might approach a fire in a cold room. On a background the deep red of old wine, a bull is charging. His body is stretched long across the panel, his legs gathered beneath him, his great head lowered and thrown slightly to one side, and around him, impossibly, weightlessly, move three slender human figures, painted in the pale and darker tones the Minoans used to tell one person from another. One stands before the animal and grips the horns. One is suspended upside down in the very air above the bull's back, mid-somersault, the whole length of the body arced like a drawn bow. And one waits behind, arms lifted, ready to catch whatever comes down. It is a single motion broken into three, the way a modern photograph might catch a diver leaving the board, entering the water, and surfacing, all at once. The Minoans had no cameras. They had only their eyes and their memory and a steady hand, and with those they froze a leap that lasted less than a second and gave it to us forever. Look at it long enough, there in the lamplight of that ancient room, and a question begins to rise, quiet and insistent. What on earth were these people doing? To vault the horns of a charging bull is not a thing anyone does lightly. A grown bull of the old Cretan breed would have stood heavy and quick, a wall of muscle with a mind of its own, and the space between its horns is the last place a sensible person would choose to be. And yet here they are, again and again, across frescoes and carved seals and little bronze figures no bigger than your hand, the leaper caught forever in the moment of flight. Whoever these young athletes were, someone thought the sight of them important enough to press into the walls of the most sacred rooms on the island. This was not a doodle. This was a thing that mattered. The trouble is that no one wrote down why. And so, in the long quiet since, people have offered their guesses, and each guess tells you something. Some have looked at the leaping and seen sport, plain and simple, a display of daring and grace, the ancient cousin of the acrobat and the gymnast, performed for a crowd that gasped and cheered as crowds have always done at the sight of the human body defying what the body should be able to do. Perhaps there were champions. Perhaps a young leaper who timed the vault just so became, for a season, the talk of the town, their name carried from courtyard to courtyard. It is a gentle thought, and it may well be true. Others have looked closer and seen something more solemn. In many cultures the world over, the young are made to pass through an ordeal at the threshold of adulthood, sent into the wilderness, marked upon the skin, set some trial that separates the child left behind from the grown person who returns. And what better trial, on an island that loved the bull above all other creatures, than to stand before the beast and leave the ground? Perhaps these leapers were not professionals at all but the sons and daughters of good families, boys and girls at the edge of adulthood, and the leap was the moment they became something new. To have done it, to have felt the horns pass beneath you and the broad warm back beneath your hands and the earth rise up again to meet your feet, that would be a thing you carried the rest of your life. You would be, ever after, one who had danced with the bull and lived. And there is a third reading, older and stranger, and it is the one that lingers longest as the room grows dim. It says the leap was never a game at all, nor merely a rite of passage, but an act of worship, that the bull was holy, and to vault him was to touch the divine and come away breathing. For the Minoans did not keep the bull at the edges of their world. They set him at its very center. Climb, in your mind, to the roofline of one of their great buildings, and there against the sky you would have seen them, great pairs of stylized horns, carved in stone and plaster, standing along the tops of the walls and crowning the sacred places. Scholars call them the horns of consecration, and we find them everywhere the Minoans built, a shape so simple a child could draw it, two curved points rising from a base, and yet a shape they clearly held sacred, placing it where it would catch the light and be seen from far off. To walk toward one of their palaces was to walk toward a horizon lined with horns. Think of what that means. The animal that could gore a man to death was also the animal they raised above their own heads and set against the heavens. His image was pressed into their signet rings and shaped into vessels for pouring offerings, beautiful stone heads of bulls, with gilded horns and eyes of rock crystal, made so that sacred liquid could be poured out through the muzzle. Their double axe, that other great emblem of theirs, may have been the very tool that felled the sacrificial ox. The bull was strength and danger and fertility and the deep rumbling power of the earth itself, the same power that shook their island and cracked their walls without warning. And so it is not so wild a thought that to leap him was to make peace with that power, to take the most frightening thing they knew and turn it, for one held breath, into a dance. To master the bull was to master, just for a moment, the trembling ground beneath their feet. We may never know which of these is true, or whether the truth was all of them at once, changing with the season and the century, meaning one thing to the priest and another to the crowd and something else entirely to the trembling young leaper waiting their turn. The Minoans took the answer with them. What they left is the image alone, the red wall, the charging beast, the body in the air, and the certainty that whatever else this was, it sat at the heart of who they were. A people are known by what they choose to paint on their holiest walls, and these people chose this, the moment of greatest danger, met not with a weapon but with open hands and a leap. And that, perhaps, is the thread to hold as you drift. For a civilization that built its faith around the bull's raw and unpredictable strength, that raised his horns to the sky and taught its children to dance across his back, was a civilization that had made a kind of bargain with power it could not control. They had learned to leap the charging thing and land, again and again, and perhaps they came to believe they always would. But the earth beneath Crete kept older gods than the bull, gods with horns of fire and a voice that no leaper could vault. And far out on the water, on that ring of cliffs to the north, one of them had already begun, very slowly, to stir. For it stands there still, or a version of it does, guarded now behind museum glass in Heraklion, and perhaps you have seen her without knowing what you were looking at. A small woman of glazed earthenware, no taller than your hand, molded and fired in the workshops of Knossos some 3,500 years ago. Her skirt falls in tiered flounces, layer upon layer, the way the finest women of the palace dressed. Her bodice is open at the front, her breasts bare, and in each raised fist she holds a snake, one writhing up the length of each arm, their heads meeting somewhere above her tall crown. And on the very top of that crown, small and watchful, sits a spotted cat. We call her the snake goddess, though in truth we do not know her name, nor whether she was a goddess at all, or a priestess dressed to become one for the length of a rite. She was found in a stone-lined pit beneath the floor of a room at Knossos, buried with other sacred things, and she has been staring out through the centuries ever since, calm and certain, holding her serpents the way you might hold something you had long ago made peace with. Let your mind settle on her for a moment, because she opens a door onto something the palaces alone cannot tell you. The Minoans, for all their painted halls and their light wells and their deep cool storerooms, seem to have built no great temples. Search the ruins of Knossos and Phaistos and Malia and you will not find the vast columned sanctuaries of Egypt, nor the ziggurats of the East, nor any towering house raised over a single enthroned god. There are shrines, yes, small rooms with benches and offering tables, cupboards where sacred objects were kept, pillars marked with the double axe. But the beating heart of Minoan worship seems to have lived elsewhere, out of doors, up high, and down deep, in places that the earth itself had made holy long before any mason lifted a chisel. So climb with me now, in the dark, away from the palace and up the flank of the mountain the locals still call Juctas, the long ridge that rises to the south of Knossos and lies, when you look at it against the evening sky, unmistakably in the shape of a sleeping face turned upward, a broad brow, a nose, a bearded chin, a giant at rest along the horizon. The Minoans climbed this mountain. Near its northern summit they cleared a space and built a low wall, and there, under the open sky, they lit fires and made their offerings. Archaeologists digging through the ash of that peak sanctuary found the leavings of centuries of devotion pressed into the burnt earth, hundreds upon hundreds of little clay figurines. Small men with their arms pressed to their chests in a gesture of prayer. Small women in the tiered skirts. And, more touching than any of them, clay models of the parts of the body, a leg, an arm, a hand, a foot, a swollen torso, a head. You do not have to strain to imagine what these were. A shepherd with a bad knee, a mother with a fevered child, a man whose chest ached in the night, each of them carrying a small clay likeness of the hurt up the long slope and laying it in the fire, asking whatever listened there to make the flesh whole. 3,500 years later, the ache is gone and the person is gone, but the small clay leg remains, and through it, so does the asking. Think of what it meant to worship this way. There was no roof between the worshipper and the sky. The altar was the mountaintop, the ceiling was the whole turning field of stars. On the night of a festival the fires on junctures would have been visible for miles, from the palace below, from the fields, from the sea. A flame on the sleeping giant's brow, answered perhaps by fires on other peaks across the island, so that all of Crete on certain nights became a chain of small lights burning up toward the dark. And when the rite was done and the embers cooled, the sacred place did not lock behind a bronze door. It simply waited, empty and open, for the wind and the next pilgrims. Where they did not climb, they descended. All across Crete the Minoans carried their offerings down into caves, into the dripping limestone throats of the mountains, past the reach of daylight, to leave bronze double axes and figurines and cups on ledges deep in the dark. There was the great cave at Sycro high on the Lacythi plateau, and the cave on Mount Ida where, much later, the Greeks would say the infant Zeus had been hidden and raised. But the Minoans were there first, threading down by torchlight into the cold breath of the rock, setting their small gifts in the places where the mountain opened into the underworld and the water fell endlessly into pools no eye could see the bottom of. Peak and cave, the highest place and the deepest, as though the divine lived at the two ends of the world and the palace, with all its wealth, was merely the crowded middle. And it seems, from everything they left us, that the ones who led them into these places were women. Look again at the frescoes and the seal stones and the little figurines, and you will notice how often it is a female figure at the center of the sacred moment, seated on a mountaintop with lions flanking her, or standing beneath a sacred tree while worshippers reach up to shake its branches, or receiving the offerings of a procession. The men in these scenes are the ones who bring and bow, the woman is the one who is served. We should be careful, a fresco is not a creed, and we cannot read the theology of a lost people off their painted walls with any certainty. But the pattern is there, again and again, and it suggests a faith in which the door to the holy was opened by priestesses, in which the greatest power a person could stand before wore, more often than not, a woman's form. No towering temples, then. No single all-ruling god enthroned in gold. Instead a religion braided into the living land itself, the summit where the fires burned, the cave where the water fell, the grove where the old tree was shaken until its leaves gave up whatever secret the branches held. A faith you could not conquer by burning a temple, because it had no temple to burn, it lived in the mountains, and the mountains do not fall. Or so it must have felt, to those who climbed junctures with a clay leg in their hands and laid it in the fire and walked back down certain that the giant on the horizon was only sleeping, and kindly, and on their side. But it is worth remembering, as you drift toward sleep, that the peak sanctuaries did not last unbroken to the end. Somewhere in the long life of Minoan Crete, the great palace at Knossos was thrown down once and rebuilt, the whole island shaken, the storerooms cracked, the fires scattered. And when the archaeologists sift the deepest layers of ash on the mountaintops, they find, threaded among the little praying figures, the marks of something the priestesses on their summits had not asked for and could not send away. The earth, it seems, had begun to answer their fires with fires of its own. And so the fires on the mountaintops flickered and were answered, and the palaces were shaken and raised again, and through all of it the Minoans kept doing the small, patient thing that every complicated people learns to do sooner or later. They began to write things down. Imagine, for a moment, a clerk in one of the storerooms at the foot of Knossos, in the cool of the early morning before the heat has climbed into the courtyards. He has before him a lump of soft grey clay, worked with a little water until it holds a print the way wet sand holds the shape of a shell. In his hand is a stylus of bone or bronze, no thicker than a reed, and with the tip of it he presses lines into the clay, quick, sure, practiced strokes, the marks of a man who has done this 1,000 mornings and will do it 1,000 more. He is not writing poetry. He is almost certainly counting sheep, or oil, or bolts of cloth, or measures of grain going out to the workshops. But he is writing, and the marks he leaves will outlast his palace, his island, his gods, and his name. Before those flowing marks, the Cretans had tried something older and stranger, a writing made of little pictures. Scholars call it Cretan hieroglyphic, though it has nothing to do with Egypt. It is the island's own invention, a run of tiny stamped and scratched images pressed most often into seal stones and clay bars. There is a hand, a ship, an eye, a branch of some plant, a head shown in profile, a shape that might be a gate and might be a loom. You can gaze at them for a long while, half drowsing, and feel that you are on the very edge of understanding, that if you only looked a moment longer the little pictures would resolve into words the way a face resolves out of shadow. They will not. We can see that a hand means something, but we do not know whether it stood for a hand, for the sound at the start of the word for hand, or for something we would never guess in 100 years of looking. The pictures survive. The reading of them is gone. Out of that picture writing, over generations, came the smoother, quicker thing the clerk in our storeroom is using, a script we call Linear A, because its signs are made of lines rather than little drawings, the pictures worn down over time into shorthand the way a much-repeated word softens on the tongue. It is a genuine writing system, a real script with perhaps 80 or 90 signs that seem to stand for syllables, and a set of separate marks for numbers and for the goods being counted. And here is the quiet marvel of it, the thing to hold as you settle deeper into the pillow. We can very nearly read it, and we cannot understand a word. Because Linear A was later borrowed and adapted by the mainland Greeks for their own accounts, in the related script we call Linear B, and Linear B was famously cracked in the middle of the 20th century, we can make good guesses at the sound of many Linear A signs. We can sound them out, syllable by patient syllable, like a child running a finger under the letters. But the sound spell words in a language nobody living has ever heard, not Greek, not anything we can confidently place on the great family tree of tongues. The Minoans wrote in their own speech, and their own speech died with them, and so we are left holding a book we can pronounce and cannot comprehend, murmuring the shapes of their sentences into a silence that gives nothing back. The tablets, for the most part, are the humblest kind of writing there is, lists. So much wool to this shrine, so many head of livestock from this estate, so many workers, so many jars. Dull, you might think, and yet there is something almost unbearably tender in it, that the things which survived are the receipts and the tallies, the paperwork of ordinary abundance. And not all of it is ledgers. Linear A turns up in places no accountant would bother with. It is scratched onto ladles and cups and little offering tables of stone, set up in the peak sanctuaries and the sacred caves, the very mountaintops where, in the chapter just behind us, the fires burned and the clay limbs were laid down. Again and again, across these holy vessels, the same short sequence of signs appears, a little formula repeated from shrine to shrine as though it were a prayer, or a dedication, or the name of whatever it was they hoped was listening. We can read those signs aloud. We simply do not know to whom they were addressed, or what they asked, or whether the asking was ever answered. The Minoans wrote their prayers on stone and left them on the peaks, and we can hold the stone and cannot hear the prayer. And then there is the strangest object of all, the one that sits a little apart from everything else, so odd that some have doubted whether it belongs to this world at all. It was found in the ruins of the palace at Phaistos, on the fertile southern plain of Crete, in the early years of the last century, a disk of fired clay, round, about the width of a spread hand, and covered on both faces with a spiral of symbols running inward toward the center like water circling a drain. Some 240 signs in all, gathered into groups, and every one of them not scratched but stamped, pressed into the wet clay with individual little seals, as though someone, thousands of years before Gutenberg, had cut a set of typefaces and printed a single page and then, so far as we can tell, printed nothing ever again. The symbols are their own alphabet of small pictures, a walking man, a plumed head, a fish, a bird, a shield, a flower, a ship. They match nothing else on Crete. They repeat in ways that feel like language, that tease the eye with the promise of grammar. And no one, not in more than a century of clever, obsessive, sleepless trying, has ever agreed on what a single word of it says. A hymn, some have argued. A calendar. A game. A prayer to a goddess. A list of places. A hoax, whisper the most suspicious, though most of them do not truly believe it. The disc spins its silent spiral in a museum case in Heraklion to this day, printed once and read by no one, keeping its meaning the way the sea keeps a drowned thing, visibly, completely, and forever out of reach. So this is where the Minoans finally elude us altogether. We have their palaces and their frescoes, their painted dolphins and their leaping bulls, their gold rings and their little praying figures on the peaks. We have their handwriting, thousands of marks of it, the everyday scratch of clerks and the careful stamp of whoever made the disc. We have, in a sense, their voice, and it speaks, and we cannot understand it. The accountant's tally and the priestess's prayer lie side by side in the same undeciphered script, equally sealed, the sacred and the mundane keeping the same perfect silence. Everything they most wanted to remember, they wrote down. And by writing it in their own lost tongue, they made certain, without ever meaning to, that it would belong to them alone. Somewhere in those unread lines, perhaps, a scribe once noted the thing that was coming, a tremor felt far out under the water, a strangeness in the harbors, a rumor carried in from an island to the north where, all this while, a mountain had been quietly filling with fire. It came, in the end, the way disaster so often does, not as a warning but as an ordinary morning. Picture Knossos in the last hour before it happened. The sun is only just clearing the low hills to the east, and the great court is still in shadow, the flagstones cool underfoot. In the storerooms, the pit-hoys stand in their rows, taller than a man, brimming with oil and grain and wine, their bellies pressed with the rope patterns that the potters loved. A clerk is somewhere among them with his tablet of soft clay, counting, pressing his little marks. Bread is baking. A child is being scolded, gently, in a language we will never hear spoken. Everything is as it has been for 200 years, and everything is about to end. You would have felt it before you understood it. A low sound, perhaps, more in the chest than in the ears, the deep groan of stone that has decided, after so long, to move. Then the ground itself, which you had trusted your whole life without ever once thinking about it, simply stopped being solid. It rolled. The flagstones of the great court lifted and fell like the deck of a ship. The tall jars in the storeroom swayed, leaned, and toppled, and 200 years of oil ran black across the floor and met the cooking fires, and where they met, the fire took. We can read all of this, still, in the ground. That is the strange gift the catastrophe left us. When archaeologists dig through the floors of the first palaces, they come to a layer that tells the whole story without a single word, a band of ash and scorched debris, of walls thrown off their footings, of columns snapped, of those enormous storage jars lying shattered where they fell. Fire and shaking, together, everywhere at once. It was not one building that failed. It was Knossos and Phaistos and Malia and the little palace at Zakros on the eastern shore, all of them, in the same terrible season around 1700 years before the birth of Christ. An island's worth of certainty came down together. We cannot be sure, even now, exactly what did it. The likeliest answer is the oldest enemy this island has ever had, the Earth itself. Crete sits where two great plates of the world grind against one another, the African pushing north beneath the European, and that slow, patient violence has always expressed itself here in tremors. Perhaps it was a single enormous quake. Perhaps it was a swarm of them, one after another over months or years, each one shrugging down a little more of what the last had left standing. Whatever the precise mechanism, the effect was the same. The storerooms that held the wealth of the palace economy were buried. The workshops where the seal cutters and the goldsmiths worked were crushed. The corridors filled with rubble and the roofs came down, and for a while, we cannot say how long, there must have been simply silence where the loudest, busiest places on the island had been. Try, for a moment, to feel what that would have meant, not as a line in a chronicle but as a thing that happened to people. These were not strangers to their palaces. The palace was the granary that fed them through a bad harvest, the treasury that held the year's surplus, the temple where the goddess was honored, the workshop where a family's livelihood was made. It was the ordering center of the whole world they knew. And in an afternoon it was gone, the food buried under stone, the sacred places broken open to the sky, the familiar rooms turned to a landscape of dust and fallen beams. There would have been the dead to find and to mourn. There would have been that particular fear that comes after the ground betrays you, the fear that will not quite leave, that waits for the next tremor in every quiet moment. A lesser people, a more brittle people, might have drifted away after that. Might have scattered to the villages, let the great courts go to grass, and become a thing that once had been. But that is not what the Minoans did. And here is where their story turns, and turns toward something that, even at this distance, is genuinely moving. They did not leave. They cleared the rubble. Stone by broken stone, they lifted their ruined world off the ground and carried it away, and on the same sacred spots, over the very cellars where the oil had burned, they began to build again. Not a patched-up, make-do version of what had stood before, something larger. Something more ambitious than anything the island had yet seen. The archaeologists have a plain name for the two ages this divides. Everything before the catastrophe they call the age of the old palaces, or the proto-palatial. Everything after, they call the new palace age, the neo-palatial. And it is the new palace age that gives us the Crete we think we know when we imagine the Minoans at all. For it was in the rebuilding, and not before it, that the palaces became the wonders we still walk through in our imagination. The Knossos of the grand staircase, of the light wells that dropped sundown through for stories, of the long processional corridors painted with figures bearing gifts, that Knossos rose from the wreck of the old one. The great court was laid out on a truly monumental scale. The storerooms were rebuilt deeper and vaster, so that the new pit hoi, when you added them together, could hold enough oil to light a small nation. The drains and the water channels, the workshops, the shrines with their horns and their double axes, all of it came back grander, more confident, more beautiful than the thing the earth had thrown down. They took the worst day their world had ever known and answered it by building the best thing their world would ever make. And they would do it again. That is the part that ought to make you sit up, even as sleep gathers at the edges of the room. This was not a single act of courage, a one-time refusal to be beaten. It became a habit of theirs, almost a signature. The earth would strike, the Minoans would clear the ground and build back finer. It happened more than once across the centuries of the palaces, and each time the pattern held, collapse, then a renaissance greater than what came before. Resilience was written into them as deeply as the undeciphered script was written into their clay. They lived on the back of a sleeping animal, and they knew it, and they built their masterpieces there anyway, and when the animal stirred and shook them off, they climbed back up and built again. It is tempting, lying here in the safe dark, to let the story rest on that note of triumph, and for a long and golden stretch of time it truly was a triumph. The new palace age was the summit of everything Minoan: the frescoes, the fleets, the far-flung trade, the sense of a people who had made peace, somehow, with a ground that would not stay still. They had faced the worst the earth beneath them could do, and they had won. They had learned the one lesson their island seemed determined to teach, that the ground will always, in the end, betray you, and that the answer is simply to build back beautiful. But there is a hardness in that confidence, too, when you look at it from where we stand, knowing what they could not. They had learned to survive the ground. They had come to trust that every blow could be answered, every ruin rebuilt, every wound outlived. And a people who have survived every disaster they can imagine may stop imagining the one they cannot. For all their skill at reading the tremors under their feet, they had no way of knowing that the deadliest thing in their world was not beneath them at all. It was to the north, out across the wine-dark water, on a beautiful round island where the fishermen mended their nets in the evening light, and, deep under the mountain at its heart, something older and far more patient than any earthquake had begun, very quietly, to wake. They had learned, over the long span of their history, to trust the ground beneath them again, and in that trust they built the most beautiful thing the ancient world had yet seen. If you had walked into a Cretan palace in those years, Knossos, or Phaistos, or Malia strung along the northern coast like a necklace of stone, you would have found yourself in a world that felt, in the most literal sense, civilized. Water ran through it. Clay pipes, tapered so the flow would not stagnate, carried fresh water into the heart of the complex and carried the used water out again, down into stone drains cut beneath the floors, drains large enough in places for a person to crawl through. Rain falling on the light wells and terraces was gathered and guided away, so that even a downpour became something managed, something the palace had thought about in advance. There were latrines flushed by diverted channels, basins for washing, cisterns holding water clear and cool through the dry Cretan summer. No other people in Europe would live this comfortably for the better part of 2,000 years, until Rome. And here it was already, humming quietly along the coast of a single island, taken so much for granted that no one thought to write down how it was done. Let yourself sink into the ordinary luxury of it. In the storerooms, the great clay jars stood in rows taller than a man, the pit hoi, their bellies ribbed with raised bands and roped handles, holding oil and wine and grain enough to feed a small town through a hard year. Walk the corridors of the west wing at Knossos and you would pass hundreds of them, cool in the shadow, the air thick with the smell of olive oil and dust and old resin. Clay tablets in the archive rooms kept the count, so many jars of oil, so many sheep, so many bolts of cloth, the careful bookkeeping of a people who had grown rich enough that abundance itself needed managing. The granaries were full. The harbors were crowded. Down at the water's edge, ships rode at anchor with their painted eyes and their cargoes of copper ingots shaped like stretched oxides, and Cretan goods traveled out across the whole eastern sea, to Egypt, where the tomb painters drew men they called Kephala carrying tribute, kilted figures with long dark curls bearing vessels of a shape no Egyptian made, to the Levant, to the Aegean islands, to the mainland of Greece where local chieftains hungered for anything that carried the shimmer of Crete about it. This was a thing to marvel at gently, an island, without armies worth the name, without walls around its palaces, holding a kind of soft dominion over the sea simply by being the place where the beautiful things came from. And the beautiful things, here the afternoon light seems almost to gather and glow. Think of the pottery they called Kamar's ware, named long after for the cave high on Mount Ida where the first pieces were found, offerings left in the dark. Cups so thin the potters of later ages nicknamed them eggshell, walls of clay pared down until they were scarcely thicker than a fingernail, so fine you could very nearly see the light through them. And across those impossibly delicate surfaces the painters ran their designs in creamy white and warm red and orange over a lustrous black ground, not the stiff geometry of other cultures but curves, spirals, whorls, forms that seem to be caught in the act of turning. A rosette that flowers and flows at once. Lilies bending in an invisible wind. Marine creatures, octopuses with their arms streaming, starfish, coral, so that a cup in your two hands became a small window onto the moving sea. There is a joy in these objects, an ease, a delight in growth and motion for its own sake, that is rare in the ancient world and almost impossible to fake. You cannot paint like that if you are afraid. And the gold. If the pottery holds the sea, the goldwork holds the light itself. The Cretan smiths worked in techniques of astonishing refinement, granulation, where minute beads of gold, some no bigger than a grain of dust, were fused to the surface without a visible seam, filigree, where drawn gold wire was coiled and soldered into lace. The masterpiece that has come down to us, found in a cemetery at Malia, is a pendant of two bees, or perhaps wasps or hornets. The scholars still argue softly over the species, curved toward each other, their wings outstretched, their legs cradling a tiny golden globe, a drop of honey, or the sun. Above them a cage of gold holds a single bead, below their bodies hang three fine golden discs that would have trembled and flashed with every movement of the wearer. It is barely 5 centimeters across, and it is one of the most perfect objects surviving from the entire Bronze Age world. Someone made that, by hand, by lamplight, thousands of years before you were born, and made it so well that we can add nothing to it. Hold that thought as you drift, a person, patient at a workbench, coaxing 2 golden insects to kiss over a drop of sun. This is what we mean when we call the New Palace period a golden afternoon. Not gold only in the metal, though there was plenty of that, but gold in the quality of the light that seems to hang over it in memory, that particular slantwise warmth of late afternoon, when the heat of the day has softened and everything is touched with amber and the shadows have grown long and kind. The frescoes on the palace walls are full of that light, young men and women with dark eyes and slender waists, processions carrying gifts, dolphins arcing through painted water, blue monkeys clambering among crimson lilies, a boy gathering saffron crocuses on a hillside that never knows winter. Ladies of the court sit and gossip in flounced skirts, their hair dressed in elaborate curls, and someone, 3,500 years ago, looked at them and thought them so charming that a French excavator, uncovering the fragment, would murmur les Parisians, the Parisian women, as though they had stepped in from a café that would not exist for another 3,000 years. Nothing in these paintings is fortified. Nothing is armored. They are pictures of a people entirely at ease in their world, and utterly convinced that the world was pleased with them in return. Perhaps it was the most refined culture Europe had yet produced. It is hard, looking at the pendant and the eggshell cups and the running water and the ledgers of oil, to argue otherwise. And there is a tenderness in dwelling here, in this long, sunlit, unhurried hour of their story, because you already know, as they could not, that afternoons do not last. The very thing that makes the golden hour so beautiful is the angle of the light, and the angle of the light is the sun going down. They had built a world with no walls because they had needed none, the sea was their wall, and the sea had always been kind. Their ships came home heavy. Their storerooms were full. Their gods, whoever they were, seemed content with the honey and the saffron and the little painted cups left in the mountain caves. And so they went on, generation after generation, refining and trading and building beautiful, breakable things, with no reason on earth to look up from their work and out across the water to the north, where, on that beautiful round island, the fishermen had begun to notice that the sea near the harbor tasted faintly of something bitter, and that the ground, some mornings, was warm. So let us leave the great island behind us for a while, and turn our little boat to the north, across water that grows deeper and bluer as the land of Crete sinks slowly astern. It is a half-day's sail, no more, on a following wind, and the sea in this season is a broad and gentle thing, breathing slow beneath the hull. You might doze here, with the sail full above you and the timbers creaking their soft old song, and wake to find a shape rising out of the haze ahead, a ring of dark cliffs cupping a bay, an island shaped almost like a crescent moon laid down upon the sea. This is Thera. The sailors know it well. They call in here on the long run north, for it sits like a stepping stone between Crete and the wider world, and its harbor is kind, and its people are rich, and its town is one of the loveliest things anyone in that whole bright age has ever built. The town has a name we have partly forgotten, and so we call it now by the name of the little modern village that sleeps above its bones, Crete. But there was nothing little about it then. As you come in from the water you would have seen it climbing the slope in tiers, house upon house, some of them 2 stories tall, some of them 3, their flat roofs stacked like the steps of a staircase made for giants. The walls were built of stone and timber laced together, a clever trick, for the timber gave the stone a way to bend when the ground shivered, and the ground here shivered often, and everyone had long since stopped being troubled by it. The upper floors were plastered smooth and washed pale, and where the plaster caught the afternoon it glowed the color of warm cream, so that the whole town seemed lit from within, a lantern set against the black volcanic hills. Come up from the harbor and walk into it, and the first thing you would notice is how it holds you. The lanes are narrow and paved, winding between the tall house fronts, and they open now and then into small squares where a well stands, or where the light pools, and the shade is cool against your neck after the glare of the sea. There is drainage beneath your feet, real drainage, clay pipes laid under the streets, carrying rainwater and waste down and away, so that the town stays clean even in the winter downpours. In the finer houses there were bathrooms, and in at least one of them a lavatory, seated over a channel that ran into that same buried network, 4,000 years ago, on a small island in the middle of the sea. It is the kind of comfort that would not be seen again in Europe for the better part of 3,000 years after it was buried. And the people who used it thought nothing of it at all. It was simply how one lived, in a good house, in a prosperous town, in the best of all the ages they could imagine. But it is the walls you would remember. Step through a doorway, out of the bright lane and into the cool dim of a room, and let your eyes adjust, and the plaster all around you would begin to move. For the people of Crete painted their houses, not with patterns only, though there were patterns, spirals and rosettes and bands of running color, but with whole living worlds. On one wall a fleet of ships sets out across a painted sea, oars bristling, banners streaming, dolphins leaping at the bows, and little painted people wave from little painted towns along the shore, and you can almost hear the drums that kept the rowers' time. On another, young women in flounced skirts move through a field, bending to gather the small purple crocus flower, plucking the crimson threads of saffron from its heart and carrying them in baskets to a seated goddess, who receives the harvest with a monkey at her side and a griffin at her back. They are doing holy work and everyday work at once, these painted girls, and their faces are calm and absorbed, and the centuries have not touched the tenderness in them. And there is a room, a small room, a private one, where the whole of 2 facing walls has been given over to spring. Rocks rise in undulating swells of red and ochre, and out of them spring clusters of lilies, red lilies on green stems, bending in a wind you cannot feel, and above them, everywhere, darting and wheeling and pairing off in the painted air, are swallows. Swallows chasing, swallows courting, swallows tumbling beak to beak in the joy of the returning warmth. No people at all in that room, only the flowers and the birds and the endless soft motion of the year turning over into light. Someone loved the spring so much that they wished to live inside it always, and so they had it painted round them, and they lay down to sleep each night beneath the swallows, and woke each morning beneath them, and thought, no doubt, that the swallows would always come. So you might spend a whole afternoon here, drifting through the lanes of the bright town, and find no sorrow in it anywhere. Down at the workshops a potter is turning a cup so thin the light comes through it. In a storeroom, great jars taller than a child stand in patient rows, heavy with oil and grain and wine, sealed and waiting. A merchant weighs out something precious on a set of lead weights, frowning, licking his thumb. Children run the paved lanes barefoot. Somewhere a loom knocks its steady rhythm, and the smell of bread comes and goes on the warm air, and the light slides slowly down the pale walls as the sun goes over, gilding first the upper stories, then the doorways, then the pavement, then nothing. It is, in every way that anyone there could measure, a finished world. Comfortable, beautiful, safe. A place that had every reason to believe in tomorrow. And yet, if you had stayed the night, and lain awake as the town breathed and settled around you, you might have felt it, the thing they had all learned not to feel. A low sound first, more in the chest than the ear, a groan from very far down, as though the island were shifting in an uneasy sleep. Then the faint chatter of a cup against a shelf. A trembling in the water of the well. The dust sifting down from a rafter in a thin grey thread. And then stillness again, and the night going on as before. They knew these tremors. Their grandparents had known them, and their grandparents before that. The very way they built their houses, laced with saving timber, was an answer to them. When the shaking came, they went out into the streets and waited, and when it passed they went back in, and swept up the dust, and mended the cracked plaster, and thought no more about it. The ground had always grumbled here. The ground had never meant anything by it. But in these last seasons the grumbling had changed. It came more often now, and it lingered. The fishermen down at the harbour had begun to mutter that the sea itself tasted wrong close into shore, faintly bitter, faintly warm, and that in certain coves a thin haze hung over the water where no fire burned. Something beneath the beautiful crescent island was stirring, slowly, patiently, gathering itself in the dark. And the people of the bright town, wise in every art they knew, skilled and gentle and utterly at home in their world, had no name for it, and no way to read it, and no idea at all what it was preparing to become. And so we come to the morning it began, though no one living on the island would have called it a beginning. To them it was only another day, cool and clear, the light coming up soft and gold over the water the way it always had. In the town they call Crete today, we do not know what its people called it. The ovens were already warm, and the smell of baking bread drifted through the narrow lanes between the tall houses. Somewhere a loom clacked. Somewhere a child was being scolded, gently, for something small. The saffron gatherers would have been out on the hillsides, and the potters at their wheels, and down at the harbour the boats were being readied as they had been readied every fair morning for 1,000 years. It was, in every way that mattered to the people who lived it, an ordinary day. That is the part we must hold on to, softly, as we watch, that they did not know. For weeks the ground had been speaking more loudly. The tremors had grown frequent enough that, at some point we cannot date, the people had done a thing that saved every one of their lives. They had left. Quietly, sensibly, in the manner of folk who had felt the earth complain before, they had gathered what they could carry and gone, down to the boats, out across the water, away to Crete or the smaller islands, wherever family and safety lay. We know they left because of what the archaeologists found, or rather did not find. No bodies in the ruins. No skeletons huddled in doorways as at that other, later, Roman town. No gold, no fine jewelry, no treasure abandoned in the panic. The people of Crete had time, and they used it, and they walked out of their beautiful town and did not look back, carrying their children and their small precious things, leaving the bread in the ovens and the pots on the shelves. And the town waited, empty and perfect and silent, for what was coming. When it came first as a warning the empty streets could not hear. A layer of fine pumice began to fall, light as snow, drifting down out of a sky that had started to haze and yellow. It gathered on the flat roofs and in the empty courtyards, a soft grey blanket settling with no one to sweep it away. This first fall was gentle, almost tender, and it went on for hours, perhaps for a day, building slowly across the abandoned rooftops. Had you stood on a distant shore and watched, you might have seen only a strange tall cloud rising over the crescent island, a column of pale ash climbing and climbing into the high blue, spreading at its top into the shape of a great tree, or an anvil, or an open hand. It was almost beautiful. It was the mountain clearing its throat. And then the mountain woke fully, and the throat opened, and what came out of the earth was a force we have no true measure for. The magma chamber deep beneath the island, pressed and heated past all bearing, tore itself open. Seawater found its way down into that furnace, and the meeting of the two, the cold sea and the molten rock, was violence beyond violence, an explosion that shattered the whole heart of the island and flung it upward. The column of ash that had climbed so gently now roared into the sky with unimaginable speed, punching up through the clouds, up past where birds fly, up past where weather is made, 30 miles and more into the cold black edge of the stratosphere. From the deck of a ship far out on the Aegean it would have filled the whole northern sky, a pillar of darkness lit from within by lightning, standing over the sea like something that had decided to stand there forever. We would like to imagine it happening slowly, and in a way it did, spread over days rather than moments, phase folding into phase. But there was a heart to it that was not slow at all. The great column, having risen so high, grew too heavy to hold itself up, and it fell. It collapsed back down upon the island in torrents of scorching ash and stone and gas, surges that raced outward across the ground faster than any horse could run, burying everything they touched. And it was these that came for the silent town. The pumice that had fallen so softly was joined now by heavier stuff, by surge after surge, until the tall houses that had stood 3 stories high were swallowed to their rooftops and then buried past them, sealed away beneath meters of ash and stone. The frescoes on the walls, the blue monkeys, the boys with their fish, the ladies in their fine dress, the ships in their harbor, were pressed into the dark and held there, unseen, unbreathing, waiting out the centuries in a silence more complete than any tomb. Crete became, in the space of a few days, a city under the ground. And the island itself was dying as its town was buried. So much rock and ash had been torn from beneath it and hurled into the sky that the ground had nothing left to rest upon. The center of the island, the great mountain that had stood at its heart, simply fell, collapsing inward, downward, into the emptied chamber below, into the sea. Where a mountain had been there was now a hole in the world, and the Aegean rushed in to fill it, boiling and churning, drowning the drowned. What had been a round green island with a peak at its center became a broken ring of cliffs around a flooded wound, the shape you can still sail into today, that curve of dark water ringed by walls of layered ash where the tourist boats now drift. The heart of the beautiful crescent island had been blown into the sky and swallowed by the sea, all in a handful of days, and the smoke of it hung over the Aegean for a long time after, turning the sun to a dim coin and the moon, they say, to the color of blood. How much of the sky the ash filled, how far the darkness spread, how many distant peoples looked up in fear at a sun gone strange, these are questions we will come to. For the moment, let us stay here, in the quiet after, when the surges have stopped and the last pumice has settled and the new-made ring of cliffs stands steaming over the black water. The town is gone, but its people are not dead, they are elsewhere, on other shores, and perhaps some of them are standing at the water's edge even now, looking north to where their island used to be, watching the pillar of ash lean and thin against the evening. They carried their children out. They saved themselves. But their home is buried, and their fields are ash, and the great world they belong to, the world of Crete across the water, the palaces and the fleets and the painted halls, the whole bright civilization that this island had been a jewel of, that world felt the blow too, though it did not yet know how deep the wound went. For the ash did not stay over the island. The winds took it, high and cold, and carried it out across the sea toward the great green mother island to the south, toward Crete and its unguarded harbors and its palaces full of light. And what it carried with it, the darkness, and the cold, and the ruin of 1,000 fields, was only the first breath of a change that would move through the whole of that world like a slow tide going out, and never quite coming back in. The sea, that night, did not know it had changed. It moved as it always had, dark and patient, the long swells rolling south from the wound in the world toward the island that had made a whole civilization from trusting it. And on the northern shore of Crete, in the harbors where the ships came home, the water lay quiet against the stone. Fishermen slept. Watchmen dozed by their small fires. The painted halls of the great houses stood cool and still in the starlight, and no one there had felt the mountain tear itself open across the water. They had only seen, perhaps, a strange bruise of color low in the northern sky at dusk, and thought little of it, and gone to their beds. But the wave was already coming. It had been born in the moment the sea rushed in to fill the emptiness where an island used to be, and it traveled faster than any ship, faster than any messenger, a low broad shoulder of water moving through the deep with almost nothing to show for itself on the surface, a swell you might not even notice from a boat. It was only when it reached the shallows, when the sea floor rose to meet the land, that it gathered itself up and remembered how much of it there was. And so it arrived on the north coast of Crete not as a storm but as something stranger and worse, the water drawing back first, further than any tide, bearing the harbor floor, leaving the fishing boats tilted in the mud and the fish flapping in the sudden air. And then it returned. Not breaking, at first, but simply rising, filling the harbors to their brims and past them, climbing the quays and the slipways, lifting the beached ships and carrying them inland, driving through the storehouses and the workshops that crowded the water's edge, and pulling all of it back out again as it withdrew. Amnisos, the little port that served the great palace at Knossos, seems to have felt this. Archaeologists have found there the strange, disordered signatures that fast-moving water leaves behind, walls shoved from their footings, building stones tumbled and scattered, layers of sediment where sediment should not be, and among it the pale dusting of volcanic ash pressed into the ruin. The sea had come ashore, and taken back with it whatever it pleased. Consider what that meant for a people such as these. The Minoans were not a land empire in the way we usually picture empires. They had no great walls that we can find, no clear sign of a standing army, no fortress cities bristling against invasion. Their strength was the sea itself, their ships, their harbors, their long confident reach across the eastern Mediterranean, the trade that brought copper and tin and ivory and gold to their island and carried their oil and their painted pottery outward to Egypt and the Levant and the isles between. The sea was their wall and their road and their fortune all at once. It was, in a sense, their god. You feel it in the dolphins that swim across their frescoes, in the octopus curling around their jars, in the leaping fish and the rippling blue that fills so much of their art. And now that same sea had climbed out of its bed in the dark and smashed the harbors and drowned the ships and pulled the storehouses back into the deep. Whatever confidence a sea people draws from believing the water is theirs, that must have cracked, that night, in a way no fresco could paint over. And then, in the days that followed, the ash. Not the great smothering blanket that fell on the doomed towns of Thera itself, but something thinner and quieter and, in its own slow way, no less cruel. The wind carried the fine grey dust south and let it settle over the fields of central and eastern Crete, a pale film across the barley and the vines and the olive groves, over the grazing land, over the cisterns and the springs. How thick it lay, and how much harm it did, is one of the things the scholars still argue over, leaning across their tables of soil samples and sediment cores. Some read the evidence and see a heavy fall, enough to poison the water, sicken the flocks, sour the soil, ruin a harvest or two or three in a place where a ruined harvest meant hunger. Others find only a light dusting, too thin to kill a crop outright, and look elsewhere for the real damage. For here is the puzzle that has kept them talking for 100 years. The eruption came, by our best reckoning, in the 17th or 16th century before our era, but the Minoan palaces did not fall silent then. Knossos and its sister houses went on. They were rebuilt, repainted, relived in. The Golden Island kept its light for another generation, perhaps two, perhaps more, before the darkness truly closed over it. So the wave and the ash did not end them. That much seems clear. And this is where the story grows subtle, and turns from the loud catastrophe you can see to the slow one you can only infer. Because a civilization built on the sea does not die only from drowned harbors. It dies, perhaps, from what the drowning sets in motion. Think of the ships that were lost, not just the hull smashed at Amnisos, but the whole rhythm of a trading world thrown out of time. Think of the island of Thera itself, which had been a Minoan place, a stepping stone and a partner in that web of exchange, and which was now simply gone, its harbors vanished, its people scattered or dead, one bright knot in the net cut clean away. Think of the neighbors and customers around the eastern sea who had looked to Crete as the great power of the waters, and who now saw that power stagger. Trade is a matter of confidence as much as cargo, and confidence, once shaken, does not always come back. The historians who study this speak less and less of a single killing blow and more of a long unraveling, a weakening at the roots, a slow poison working through the economy and the harvests and the faith of a people, so that when the next shock came, whatever it was, there was less strength left to meet it. For something did come after. Within a few generations of the mountain's death, the great palaces of Crete were burned and broken, and this time they did not rise again in the old way. A new order took their place, one that looked and sounded and worshipped differently, one whose records were kept in a different tongue. The bright sea empire, with its dolphins and its dancing and its trust in the water, gave way. And no one can say for certain how much of that end reaches back to the wave that came ashore in the dark, to the ash on the barley, to the harbors full of ruined ships. The line from the mountain to the fall of the palaces is long, and it runs through shadows we cannot fully light. Some say the eruption began it. Some say the two are further apart than they look, and the connection is a story we tell because we want disasters to have single causes. The truth is tangled in the soil, still being teased apart core by core. But this we can say. The Golden Island, that night and in the years after, had begun to feel the cold that would eventually settle over it for good, the slow tide going out that its own painted halls could not yet red. Something had shifted in the world of the great green mother island, some balance tipped that would not tip back. And on the mainland to the north, across a different stretch of that same restless sea, other people were watching. People who did not paint dolphins. People who built walls of stone so heavy the later Greeks would swear only giants could have raised them. They had long looked to Crete with something between envy and awe, and they were about to find the great sea power weaker than it had ever been. Rest now, and let your mind drift north across the water, away from the painted halls of Knossos and toward a rougher, harder country, the mainland of Greece, where the men who would inherit the Aegean were already sharpening their world. They were not a gentle people, these mainlanders. The Minoans, for all their power, had built a civilization that seemed to breathe out rather than in, open courtyards, unwalled towns spilling down to the shore, palaces you could walk into from any direction, as if the sea itself were the only wall they needed. Their art was full of soft things. Lilies bending in an imagined wind. Blue monkeys picking saffron on a hillside. Dolphins turning through painted water above a queen's bath. Even their goddesses seemed to hold snakes the way one might hold flowers, carefully, almost tenderly, as though danger were only another thing to be arranged into beauty. But across that restless stretch of water, in the folded valleys of the Argolid and the Peloponnese, a different kind of people had been rising. And where the islanders painted flowers, these newcomers dreamed of swords. We call them the Mycenaeans, after the greatest of their strongholds, Mycenae, a name the later Greeks would speak with a kind of shiver, the city of Agamemnon, the city of gold. But that name came afterward, from poets looking back across centuries. In their own age they were simply the lords of the mainland, chieftains and warrior kings who spoke an early form of Greek, the first Greek ever written, and who buried their dead not with lilies but with weapons. Picture, if you like, the shaft graves that these men left behind, deep rectangular pits sunk into the earth, and lowered into them the bodies of princes wrapped in astonishing wealth. Masks of beaten gold laid over their faces, so that even in death they wore a hard, calm, golden expression, staring up forever at a sky they had left. Beside them, daggers. Not ceremonial trinkets, but real fighting blades, their bronze surfaces inlaid with scenes of the hunt, running lions, men with tall shields facing them down, the whole small drama of courage and killing worked in gold and silver against the dark metal. These were people who wanted to be remembered for what they could take. And there is one object above all that tells you who they were. The boar's tusk helmet. Imagine the patience of it. A hunter brings down a wild boar, one of the most dangerous animals of the Greek forests, and instead of discarding the curved tusks, he saws them into small curved plates. Dozens of them. 30, 40, 60 tusks, meaning as many boars hunted and killed, all of it to armor a single head. The plates are sewn in overlapping rows onto a cap of leather and felt, curving up to a point, so that the finished helmet gleams pale and ridged like something grown rather than made. To wear one was to wear your kills. It announced, before you had lifted a spear, that you and your father and your father's father had been men who went into the forest after the tusk death and came back. The Minoan lord surrounded himself with images of a world tamed into loveliness. The Mycenaean lord put the wild boar on his own skull and called it a crown. Now let yourself feel, slowly, the way the sea between them began to change its meaning. For centuries, you have heard this already in the earlier hours of our story, Crete had been the elder. It was the island that traded with Egypt, that sent its ships as far as the Levant, that gave the smaller mainland settlements their models for how a great house should look, how a fine cup should be shaped, how a wall painting should hold light. When the mainland princes wanted beautiful things, they looked to the island and, in the beginning, they largely imitated. Their earliest fine pottery echoes Minoan pottery. Their earliest palace ideas, their columns tapering downward, their frescoes of processions and bull leapers, all of it carries the accent of Crete, the way a young country speaks in the borrowed phrases of an older one it admires. The relationship, at the start, ran one way. Crete gave, the mainland received, unenvied, unlearned. But envy is a patient thing, and it does not always stay grateful. Through the long span of the 15th century before our era, the very years when Crete had been shaken, first by the great convulsion of the earth and the burning that followed, then by the far heavier blow that came from beyond the northern horizon, the mountain that tore itself apart and salted the island's fields with ash, through all those years of the island's quiet weakening, the mainland had been doing the opposite. Its strongholds had been growing. Its graves had been filling with more gold, not less. Its warriors had been ranging further out onto the water in ships of their own, no longer content to wait on the beach for a Cretan sail. And somewhere in that slow crossing of the scales, the balance tipped. It is not a moment you could mark on a calendar. There was no single day when the elder became the younger. It happened the way a tide turns, imperceptibly, so that a man standing on the shore at dusk would swear the water was still coming in, right up until he noticed the wet sand widening at his feet and understood that it had, for some while now, been going out. And so the island that had taught the mainland everything found, for the first time in living memory, that the pupil had grown stronger than the teacher. Crete was still beautiful. Knossos still stood, its corridors still glowed with painted processions, its storerooms still held their great jars. To a traveler arriving by ship, it would still have looked like the center of the world. But it was a center that no longer commanded. Its fleet, once the terror and the shield of the whole Aegean, could not do what it had always done, could not keep the northern ships at a respectful distance. And the northern lords, watching from their walled citadels, felt the change in the water the way seabirds feel a coming storm. They saw a great sea power weaker than it had ever been. They saw open harbors and undefended towns and storerooms heavy with the accumulated wealth of centuries. They saw, in short, everything they had spent generations envying, and they saw that no one was any longer strong enough to keep them from reaching out and taking it. What exactly happened next is one of the quietest mysteries in all of this long story, and we will come to it in its own hour. Whether they came with fleets and fire, or whether they simply arrived, over years, first as traders and then as guests and then as masters, moving into the great house so gradually that no one could name the day it stopped being Cretan, that is a question the soil is still, even now, being asked to answer. The clay tablets found in the ruins of Knossos are written, when at last we can read them, not in the old island script but in early Greek. That single strange fact hangs over everything, a small hard clue glinting in the ash. At some point in these darkening years, the men who ran the greatest palace on Crete were keeping their accounts in the tongue of the mainland. The lilies had not been painted over. But the hand holding the pen had changed. And for now, as you drift toward sleep, hold only this, that the golden island, still lovely in the last of its light, had begun to belong to strangers from the north. There is a smell that comes before a house burns, and the people of Crete would have known it well, the sharp resin of cypress beams, the fat of stored oil, the dry sweetness of grain kept too long in the dark. In the years around 1450 before our era, that smell rose over the island again and again, from one great house after another, until the horizon itself seemed to be learning a new color. You have followed these palaces for many hours now, through their painted corridors and their cool storerooms, through the seasons of the double axe and the dance of the bulls. Tonight, gently, you must watch them go quiet. Not all at once. Not with a single great catastrophe you could name and set down in a book. But house by house, hearth by hearth, the way a lamp gutters when the oil runs low, a flame that leans, and steadies, and leans again, and then is simply gone. Phaistos, on its long ridge above the Massara plain, had watched the sun cross the same fields for centuries. Its wide court, its ceremonial stair broad enough for 100 souls to gather, its rooms where scribes had pressed the old island signs into damp clay, all of it fell silent in these years, the fine rooms abandoned, the great complex never again to rule as it had. Away to the north, Malia by its shallow sea, where the sand is soft and the light in summer turns the whole coast to hammered bronze, went the same way. And in the far east, at Zakros, tucked into its narrow valley where the mountains come down almost to the water, Zakros, the last palace built, the newest and in some ways the loveliest, with its spring-fed cistern and its workshops still smelling of ivory and bronze, Zakros burned. The fire there was fierce enough that the archaeologists who came 3,500 years later found the rooms sealed as they had been abandoned, precious things left where they lay, as though the people had gone out expecting to come back and simply never did. Think, for a moment, of Gournia, not a palace at all but a whole town, a warren of little houses climbing a low hill, streets so narrow you could touch the walls on either side, potters and smiths and weavers living wall to wall as families had for generations. Gournia, too, fell quiet in this age. The looms stopped. The kilns cooled. The small ordinary life of the place, a life of grinding grain and mending nets and calling children in from the lanes at dusk, thinned out and drifted away, and the sea wind moved through empty doorways where there had once been the smell of cooking and the sound of someone singing at their work. We do not know, precisely, why. Fire, certainly. Perhaps earthquake before the fire, or after it. Perhaps raiders from the sea, or unrest from within, or some long slow failure of the trade and the harvests that had held it all together. The soil keeps its reasons close. What it gives us instead is ash, a thin dark layer, pressed between the centuries, that lies over site after site across the island like a single closing sentence written in a hand we cannot read. And yet, in the middle of all this quiet, one great house did not fall silent. Knossos, the largest, the oldest, the labyrinthine heart of the whole island, the palace whose corridors had inspired every story you have ever half remembered about a maze and a monster at its center, Knossos went on. Its lamps still burned. Its storerooms still filled and emptied with the turning of the year. Its scribes still sat, as scribes had sat there for as long as anyone could remember, pressing their marks into wet clay by the light of small flames. From a distance, in these years, you might have looked at Knossos and thought that nothing had changed at all, that here, at least, the old world had held. But if you had leaned close, over the shoulder of one of those scribes, and looked at the clay drying in his hand, you would have seen the strangeness of it. the signs were not the old ones. For centuries the palaces of Crete had kept their accounts in a script we call Linear A, a writing that belonged wholly to the island, to a language we still cannot speak, a tongue that died with the people who thought in it. But the tablets of Knossos in this last age are written in something else. We call it Linear B, and it grew out of the older signs the way a graft grows out of an old rootstock, the same clay, the same reed stylus, the same patient counting of sheep and oil and wheat and swords. And when scholars at last found the key to it, more than 3,000 years on, in a quiet room in 1952, the language that came whispering out of the clay was not the lost tongue of Crete at all. It was Greek. Early, archaic, strange to the ear, but Greek. The language of the mainland. The language of the men who built their fortresses at Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos, behind walls so vast that later Greeks believed only giants could have raised them. So here is the thing you must carry with you into sleep. The palace still stood. The frescoes of lilies and leaping dolphins were not scraped from the walls. The bull still ran, painted, across the plaster of the great rooms. To the eye, Knossos was Cretan still, as beautiful and as strange as it had ever been. But the hand holding the pen was Greek now. The men who counted the flocks, who tallied the bronze and the chariots and the perfumed oil, who decided what came into the storerooms and what went out, they wrote their accounts in the speech of the North. A civilization was being kept, and counted, and quietly ruled, in a language that had never been its own. The old island was not destroyed at Knossos. It was inhabited. Worn like a borrowed cloak. Ruled from within its own most sacred halls by newcomers who had learned to love its comforts and had made themselves at home among its painted walls. And you might ask, as the scholars still ask, turning the same worn questions over by lamplight, how it happened. Whether the Mycenaeans came as conquerors in a single hard season, swords bright in the harbours, and took the last standing palace by force. Or whether they had already been there for a generation or more, married into the old families, learned the old ways, so that the change of hands was less a conquest than a slow inheritance nobody quite noticed until it was complete. Whether the fires that took Phaistos and Zakros and Gournia were set by these same northern men, clearing the ground of rivals, or whether Crete was already faltering, already loosening its grip, and the Mycenaeans simply walked into a house whose owners had begun, for reasons of their own, to leave. The ash does not say. It only lies there, thin and dark and patient, keeping its silence over the whole green length of the island. But Knossos, too, was living on borrowed time. The Greek scribes counting their sheep by lamplight could not have known it, bent as they were over the small careful work of the day, but the last great fire was still to come, and this one would leave no house standing at all. The flame that had leaned so long, and steadied, and leaned again, was very nearly spent. And what happened in that final burning, and why, when it was over, no one ever again wrote a single word on Cretan clay, is the question the ashes of Knossos have been holding, all this time, waiting for you on the far side of sleep. For a long time after the palaces fell silent, the island went on being lived in, and the people who lived there walked among the ruins the way you might walk through a room whose furniture has been rearranged by someone you never met. The great house at Knossos did not vanish all at once. Its walls stood, roofless in places, half buried in others, and grass came up between the paving stones where processions had once moved in their painted robes. Children who had never seen a scribe pressing signs into wet clay climbed over the fallen thresholds and did not know that the ground beneath them had been the beating center of a world. And slowly, over the long tide of centuries, the memory of what that place had been did not so much disappear as change its shape, the way a stone changes shape in a river, worn softer, rounder, less itself, until what remains is beautiful and strange and no longer quite true. Think of how a story survives when the people who could explain it are gone. It survives in fragments. It survives in the wrong hands and the right imaginations. The Greeks who came later, the singers and the wanderers and the men who told tales by the fire while the wine went round, looked upon the ruins of Crete and felt the weight of something enormous that had been there before them. They could see the size of the walls. They could count the endless rooms, the corridors that turned and doubled back, the stairways that climbed to nothing and the store chambers that ran on into the dark. They could not read the writing. They did not know the names. But they knew, the way you know a thing in your chest without being able to prove it, that a great king must once have ruled here, a king with power beyond anything their own small kingdoms could imagine. And so they gave him a name. They called him Minos. Sleep now, and let the name settle. Minos, king of Knossos, lord of 100 cities, master of the sea. In the stories the Greeks told, he was the first ruler ever to command a fleet, to clear the waters of pirates, to make the islands pay him tribute. And in this, strangely, the legend remembered something the legend could not have known, that there had indeed been a power on Crete that reached across the water, that ships had gone out from these shores in numbers no one else could match. The Greeks called this remembered dominion the thalassocracy, the rule of the sea, and they placed it in the deep past, in the age of heroes, before their own grandfathers' grandfathers were born. They were right that it had existed. They had simply forgotten everything else about it, the language, the goddesses, the leaping bulls, the whole shining machinery of a civilization. All that was left was a king's name and the memory of ships. But a king needs a house, and the house the Greeks imagined was the strangest part of all. They had seen the ruins, remember, those winding passages, those rooms opening into rooms, that plan so unlike the simple halls of their own age that a stranger walking in might genuinely lose his way. And out of that bewilderment came the greatest of all the images, the labyrinth. A maze built by a master craftsman, a man so clever his cleverness became a kind of danger. They called him Daedalus, and they said Minos had summoned him to build a prison with no straight walls, a coiling stone puzzle from which no one who entered could ever find the way out. It is a marvelous invention. And it may be that the word itself carried a memory older than the story, for labyrinth seems to hold within it the labyrinths, the double axe, that sacred sign carved and painted throughout the palace of Knossos, on pillars and walls, on the very stones the Greeks were staring at. The house of the double axe. The place of the labyrinths. A word survived when everything it once meant had been forgotten, and around that surviving word a story grew to explain it. And at the heart of the maze, they said, something waited. Not a treasure. Not a throne. A monster. Half man and half bull, born of a queen and a beast, kept in the darkness at the center of the winding halls and fed on human flesh. The Minotaur, the bull of Minos. Lie still and consider how much of the real Crete is folded, dreaming and distorted, into that single terrible image. The bull that had been leapt in the sunlit courts, the bull painted charging across the frescoes, the bull whose horns crowned the rooftops in row upon row of pale stone, all of it sacred, all of it central to who these people were, comes down through the long dark of forgetting as a horror crouched in a cellar, waiting to be killed. The thing they had honored, the later world could only fear. The dancers who had somersaulted over the horns in a rite whose meaning we still cannot fully read became, in the retelling, victims sent into the dark to be devoured. You know how the story ends, or perhaps you knew it once and have half forgotten it yourself, which feels only right. A young man comes from Athens, Theseus, a prince, one of the tribute of youth sent to feed the beast. And a young woman is waiting for him, Ariadne, the daughter of the king, whose name may itself be an old title of a goddess, the utterly pure one, worn down at last into the name of a girl in love. She gives him a ball of thread. That is all. A simple thing, a length of yarn, held fast at the door and unspooling behind him as he goes down into the turning dark. He kills the thing at the center, and then, and this is the part that stays with you as you drift, he follows the thread back. Out of the maze, by the thin bright line laid down in the going, back into the light and the air and the waiting sea. A whole lost empire, and what endures of it is a monster, a maze, and a thread that leads you home. Let that be the shape of it as you sink toward sleep, a civilization reduced to a story, and the story itself as much a labyrinth as the palace ever was, each turning of it holding some small true thing, buried, mislabeled, impossible to reach directly. The Greeks were not lying. They were doing what all of us do with the past that comes to us broken. They took the ruins they could touch and the names that survived and the shapes that frightened or delighted them, and they wove from these a tale that could be carried, mouth to mouth, down the generations, when the writing itself had died. And so Minos and Daedalus and the Minotaur sailed on through 3,000 years, while the real names of the real kings sank without trace beneath them. But a legend is not the same as a memory, and a memory is not the same as knowledge. For all those centuries the story was all there was, a king, a maze, a beast, and the actual Crete, the living island of the leaping bulls and the painted queens, lay silent under the earth and under the myth, waiting. It would take a very long time, and a very stubborn man with a spade and a fortune and a theory, before anyone thought to ask whether the labyrinth had ever been real, and went digging into the hill above the sea to find out. What he uncovered there, and how much of it he saw truly, and how much he, too, dreamed into being, is the last turning of this long story, still waiting for you, just on the other side of sleep. The spring of that year came softly to Crete, as it always does, the hillsides turning green almost overnight, anemones opening red among the stones, the sea below going from winter grey to a blue so deep it seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. And onto one particular hillside, a low mound called Kephala just south of the harbour town of Heraklion, came a small, short-sighted, immensely stubborn Englishman named Arthur Evans, carrying, as he always did, a walking stick he called Prodger, which he used to prod at the ground and, when the ground gave up something interesting, to point at it in triumph. He was the son of a wealthy paper manufacturer, and he had spent that wealth buying up this hill piece by piece over the preceding years, because he was convinced, on the strength of some little engraved seal stones he had found in Athenian markets, stones no one else could read, that something enormous lay sleeping beneath it. On the 23rd of March, in the year 1900, he set his workmen to dig. And almost at once, the earth began to answer him. It answered faster than anyone was ready for. Within days the picks were striking not rubble but walls, long, deliberate walls, the ashlar blocks squared and set with a care that no rough village could have managed. Within weeks, whole rooms were opening to the sky that had not seen the sky in 3,500 years, corridors that turned and turned again, storerooms lined with rows of great clay jars taller than a man, jars called pithoi, some of them still bearing the dark stains of the oil and grain they had held when the world they belonged to ended. There were staircases that descended into cool lower stories, lit by open shafts the builders had left to draw daylight down into the deep. There were channels cut in stone for water to run, and drains, and the clean logic of a building that had been thought about by people who understood comfort. And then, one day, a workman's brush uncovered color, and the color was a face. It was a painting on plaster, a fresco, and the paint had held. A young man in profile, slender-waisted, walking through a field of lilies, his skin the warm red the old painters favored, a crown of feathers or flowers upon his head. Elsewhere they found blue monkeys climbing among rocks, and dolphins turning in a painted sea, and slim women with dark curling hair and wide bright eyes and dresses that left the shoulders bare, women so alive and so at ease that Evans's French colleagues, seeing them, are said to have exclaimed, "But they are Parisians." As though these ladies had stepped not out of the Bronze Age but out of a boulevard café. Nowhere was there a king shown crushing his enemies, no boastful carvings of conquest, none of the grim propaganda of Egypt or Assyria. Only leaping fish, and gathered flowers, and the strange endless dance of the bulls. Evan stood in the middle of it, half blind without his glasses, seeing more clearly than anyone what it meant. Here was a civilization nobody had known existed. It needed a name. And he reached, as men do, for the oldest story he knew, the story of the maze, and the beast, and the king who kept it. He named them the Minoans, after Minos, though whether Minos had been one man or a whole line of rulers or merely a title, like Pharaoh, he could not say, and no one to this day can say. The legend, which had waited so patiently in the dark, had lent its name at last to the truth beneath it. But naming a thing is not the same as understanding it, and here the story takes on its more troubling shade. For Evans did not merely uncover the palace. He rebuilt it. Where he found the stubs of columns, he raised new columns in reinforced concrete, painted red, tapering downward in the odd inverted Minoan way, because that was how they appeared in the frescoes. Where he found a fragment of a fresco, a hand, a curl of hair, a scrap of a griffin's wing, he had artists complete the rest, filling in whole figures, whole scenes, from imagination guided by taste. He roofed rooms that had lost their roofs. He gave the ruin floors and balconies and a great red columned throne room, and he called one chamber the Queen's apartment and painted dolphins on its wall, and he named another the Hall of the Double Axes, and slowly the hill became less a sight than a stage set, beautiful, evocative, and forever after impossible to disentangle from what had truly been there. He believed he was rescuing the past from decay, making it legible, letting visitors feel the life of the place. Perhaps he was. But he was also, quietly, dreaming, pouring his own longing for a peaceful, artistic, matriarchal golden age into the concrete, so that the Minoans we picture may be, in part, the Minoans Arthur Evans wished to find. He had dug up a real civilization and, in the same motion, half dug up a dream, and the two set together as they cured, and cannot now be pulled apart. And through all of it there ran a deeper silence he could not break. For among the ruins were tablets, hundreds of small clay tablets, baked hard and preserved by the very fire that had destroyed the palace, covered in a script of neat, spare signs. Evans could see it was writing. He could sort it into kinds. He called the earlier, more pictorial one Linear A, and the later, tidier one Linear B. But he could not read a word of it, not one, and though he guarded the tablets and puzzled over them for the rest of his long life, he died in 1941 with the sign still locked, the voices of the Minoans still sealed inside the clay, speaking and unheard. It would take another man, of another generation, to turn the key, and he was not a scholar at all, but an architect, an Englishman named Michael Ventris who had fallen under the spell of those tablets as a boy of 14, hearing Evans himself lecture, and had never quite escaped it. He worked at the puzzle in his spare hours, the way other men tend gardens, laying the signs out in grids, watching which ones changed at the ends of words, treating it not as a code to be broken by force but as a language to be coaxed into confessing what it was. And in 1952, patiently, almost reluctantly, the grids gave way. Linear B, he realized, was not writing the Minoan tongue at all. It was writing Greek, an ancient, early Greek, which meant that by the time these particular tablets were made, the palace at Knossos had passed into the hands of Greek-speaking newcomers from the mainland, keeping their accounts of sheep and oil and swords in the old island script. Suddenly a Bronze Age list could be read again, 3,000 years on, so many jars of this, so many workers of that, the small dry records of a working palace whispering across the dark. And yet, and this is the turn that keeps you here on the edge of sleep, the older script, Linear A, the script the Minoans wrote in their own true language before the Greeks ever came, has never been read. Ventris cracked the later tongue, the earlier one holds. We know their painted faces, their jars, their leaping bulls, their name that was never truly theirs. But their own words for themselves, for their gods, for the sea that made them and erased them, sit still in the museum cases at Heraklion, in signs we can trace with a fingertip and cannot sound aloud. A whole people restored to daylight, and still, at the very center of them, one locked room, waiting, as they have waited so long already, for someone yet to come. So let us come back, one last time, to the shore where we began. The same shore, though the light has changed, that soft, low gold of a sun already halfway into the sea, laying a road of broken brightness across the water that seems to lead all the way out to the edge of the world. The waves arrive as they always have, unhurried, folding themselves onto the sand and drawing back with a long, patient hush, as though the sea were breathing in its sleep. And you are breathing with it now, slower than when this began, the way a tide slows as it reaches its full. There is nothing left to reach for. The story has been told. All that remains is to let it settle, the way silt settles through still water, down and down until it comes to rest on the floor of the dark. Think of what we have gathered, these long hours, and how gently it all fits together. A people without a name of their own, for Minoan was a word a Victorian archaeologist borrowed from a Greek myth, and pressed onto them like a label onto an unmarked jar. A people who built palaces without walls to keep out armies, who left their storerooms undefended and their courtyards open to the light. Who painted, on the plaster of their homes, not conquerors and not massacres, but dolphins turning through blue water, lilies nodding in a breeze 3,500 years stilled, women with dark curling hair and gold at their wrists, and young men and women leaping, weightless and unafraid, over the horns of a charging bull. A people who looked at the world and, more than anything else we can find of them, chose to paint its joy. That is a strange and lovely thing to leave behind. Empires rot into their monuments to war. These islanders left us their delight. And they loved the sea that was their road and their harvest and their wall, the sea that carried their painted pots to Egypt and their oil to the courts of the pharaohs, the sea that made them rich enough to build in stone and dream in color. They were, before all else, a sea people, and it is fitting, in the sad symmetry that history sometimes offers, that it was the sea that erased them. Not in one blow, though the mountain that was once there tore itself apart in fire and buried the town of Crete under meters of ash, its rooms and staircases and jars left standing empty as a held breath. Not in one blow, but in a long unwinding, the wave that raked their harbors, the ash that grayed their fields, the ships that stopped coming, the balance of the world tilting slowly away from them until, 1 century, there was simply no one left who remembered how the palace at Knossos had looked when its lamps were lit and its corridors were full of voices. The Greeks who came after found the ruins and could not read them. So they did what people have always done with a mystery too large to hold. They made it into a story. They put a monster at the center of the maze. The labyrinth, then. That is what survived, not the truth of them but the shadow it cast. The vast branching palace of Knossos, its hundreds of rooms folding into one another around the great central court, became, in the memory of a later age, the labyrinth, a prison of stone built to hold a creature half man and half bull, fed on the young scent as tribute across the sea. You can feel, can't you, how a real thing became a dreamed one. The bull that was leapt over in celebration became the bull that devoured. The intricate house became the inescapable maze. The tribute ships that once carried oil and honor became ships of doomed children. A civilization was forgotten so completely that the only way back to it, for 3,000 years, ran through a myth. And it is a gentle irony worth holding as you drift, that the monster was never real, and the beauty was. That behind the horror of the story there had only ever been a bright, open-hearted people painting fish on their walls. They are all in the museum now, what could be gathered of them? In the cool galleries at Heraklion, behind glass, under a light kept low to spare the colors, the frescoes glow as softly as they must have glowed by lamplight in the palaces. The dolphins still turn. The lilies still lean into their vanished wind. The leapers are still suspended, forever, in the moment before they land, their hands not yet touching the bull's back, held in the air by nothing but paint and patience and the long, unlikely luck of not being destroyed. People walk past them slowly, and go quiet without quite knowing why, the way you go quiet in the presence of something that has waited a very long time to be seen. And in the same building, in cases of their own, lie the little clay tablets scored with a script no one alive can read, Linear A, the Minoans' own words in the Minoans' own tongue, still sealed, still silent, still keeping at the very heart of them the one room the daylight has never reached. We know their faces. We do not know their words for themselves. And perhaps that is the right amount to know of a lost people, as you fall asleep, enough to love them, not so much that the mystery is spent. So there is nothing left owing now, nowhere else the story needs to go. The palaces are ruins, and the ruins are quiet, and the quiet is kind. The wave that took them broke long ago and is only, now, the same soft tide that has been coming in all this while beside you, arriving and withdrawing, a sound older than any empire and gentler than any grief. Let the last of the light go down into the water. Let the island lower itself, without struggle, back into the blue it came from. There is no monster in the maze. There never was. There is only a peaceful people who painted joy on their walls and sailed out one morning into a sea they trusted, and did not come home, and were remembered, at last, not as they feared but as they truly were. So let the island sink back beneath the waves, and let your breathing slow with the tide. The Minoans are asleep now, as you soon will be, their frescoes safe in the dark, their names still whispered by the sea. If this lost world carried you somewhere quiet, there are older shores still waiting, drowned cities, forgotten kingdoms, mysteries the night has kept for us. Subscribe, and let another one find you tomorrow evening. For now, though, there is nothing more to do. Rest easy. The sea will keep the story until morning.